whoa, hold up, Shandy, you fucking what? First you say Spider-Man 1, the perfect superhero origin film, is slightly below average. Then you have the audacity to call Spider-Man 2 the greatest superhero movie of all time. Allegedly. An awful film, from a character and writing standpoint, while acknowledging that the score, cinematography, casting, and acting all top tier. These were both already utterly confusing stances to have, but then you go ahead and up one on yourself by calling Spooperman Tress the worst film in the Raimi series, one of the worst Spider-Man films in totality, and arguably a film which competed with the worst of the MCU before Phase, 3? Yeah, let's go with that. Amazingly awesome? Are you ill, mate? Explain yourself, squirrel.
Hey, what happened?
Okay, so I can tell some feathers have been ruffled with this one, and understandably so. It's not every day that a person goes against the grain 3 consecutive times in regards to one of the most beloved superhero trilogies of all time. But would you believe me if I said there was a good enough reason for it? I mean, this video is pretty long. Surely there must be something that I have to say which is capable of contrasting the popular belief that this film is poopus, right? In fact, do I even think this film is good? Or did I simply have that title as a form of clickbait to get you to watch this video? Have I been tricking you this entire time to go against the very beliefs you have had since childhood, causing you to question your reality and the very meaning of existence itself? Probably not. It's more likely that I watched the film again with the purpose of analyzing it from a lens of judging its quality, and came to the conclusion that the film is overhated by a large percentage of the internet. But not that it's an overall good movie. In fact, I think I might rip the band-aid off right now and tell you this film isn't actually a giant piece of shit, but only slightly above average in terms of quality. I'm not going to give the rating just yet, but do be aware that I'm going to be pretty charitable to this film as we go on, which I like to think I've done with the rest of the series so far, but if not, then feel free to call me a twit, goalpost moving, shit for brains, chicken nugget drinking, primordial soup swimming, anthropod of a mammal if it so pleases you. But please do stick around and hear what I have to say before impulsively disliking the video. That's not very poggers of you, my man, woman, whatever you self-identify as. Doesn't matter though, you're gorgeous anyways. And while you are down there, why don't you consider hitting the subscribe and bell buttons? Have been close to almost 100 subscribers, and would very much like to see that number going up, as it increases the dopamine I receive on a daily basis every time I watch a snotty boy glow up meme. Oh, and because it will mean you get notifications for my work once they've been uploaded, but who cares about what affects you? I'm the important one here. I think that's enough tangents, why don't you start the review already? Fine, Jesus other Shandy, I'll do it. Little bit of self-congratulation never hurt anybody. Are you still here? Spider-Man 3 is widely regarded as the worst Raimi film by quite a large number of people, while still being loved for its meme potential and introduction to characters such as Venom and Sandman. Especially Venom, who almost ruled the internet during this time period as he started becoming more and more mainstream with fans, making numerous appearances in video games, TV shows, as well as the movie. People loved the character and the studio knew this, which led to Avi Arad, a producer on the film, requesting the character's inclusion as he believed Sam Raimi was too reliant on villains he liked and needed to include someone that modern fans were more interested in. This led Raimi to replace his attempts at including Vulture, who was to be played by Ben Kingsley, with Topher Grace portraying Venom, as well as introducing the symbiote to the big screen for the first time. And the internet exploded. The teaser trailer for the film began with an iconic shot of Peter in his black suit sitting atop the bell tower of the church, and immediately people got excited for this event. This change paid off pretty nicely, as Spider-Man 3 not only earned more money at the box office compared to the first two films, becoming the third highest grossing movie of 2007 behind heavy hitters such as Pirates of the Caribbean and World's End, and Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. But it also meant the film was the highest grossing movie from Sony Columbia until 2012 Skyfall. The picture set a worldwide record for single day earnings of $104 million on Friday, only to break the record again on Saturday with another $117.6 million. This film was huge, likely because of Raimi's addition of Venom, while also coming hot off the heels of the critically acclaimed second film, although that film didn't do quite as well as its prequel. And yet, despite the massive box office success, the film was immediately criticized by reviewers and fans alike, with the common consensus being that the film wasn't as refined as its previous installments, despite being a dazzling spectacle. They noticed the film was far too packed with too much material and not enough time to handle it all effectively enough. It's odd and incredibly rare that I share the same opinion as Rotten Tomatoes critics, but hey, sometimes the stars do align. However, you get the picture. Spider-Man 3 with all its bells and whistles was a bit of a mixed bag upon release, garnering both praise and condemnation in equal fillings. It does have a dedicated group of people who praise its high heaven, similar to the prequel fans from the Star Wars community, or even the TASM fans of the web films. I just realized that's a pun. Huh. Neat. But is there something to go by in this film? Is there an element I can attach myself to where I can see why this film is praised so heavily? Can I acknowledge the flaws in it accurately? Is Spider-Man 3 really the worst of the trilogy? Well, Let's lay one on him, catch Spider-Man's hand in a cookie jar, and amplify our aggression as we duck and weave our way straight into one of the most divisive superhero movies of the generation. This lovely film begins yet again using a similar method from the first two motion pictures, as it gives us a short recollection of the events from the first two, while having these recollections strung up in a series of CGI webs. However, unlike the first film which had CGI models for our characters, and unlike the second film which used illustrations and drawings, this movie gets right down to business by just ripping clips from those films and creating what seems to be a montage of Raimi's greatest hits, as it plays some of the most important moments from the series, acting as a short synopsis of the story so far, and gets everyone back up to speed on what the current situation is supposed to be for our characters. It does however feel uninspired, especially in comparison to the second film which had a very autistic presence attached to it. This version of the opening credits feels almost artificial in comparison, as it takes away any of the impact these moments would have had in the films, simply by just playing them, something that an expressive still image could have avoided as it breathed new life into these older moments. But besides that, we also get a return of Danny Elfman's main title theme to help score a segment of this opening. And I say segment because the new Sandman and Venom themes from Christopher Young, the composer who replaced Elfman after he had creative differences with Raimi, also take turns scoring the opening, which aid in creating a much heavier and aggressive tone for the film, appropriate considering the plot and material found in the film, at least some of the time. It also assists in distinguishing itself from previous films in the series, as it no longer feels like just another add-on for the sake of a sequel, which is the vibe I got from the ripped clips. So good job, Mr. Young. And speaking of the music, what do I think of these new additions? Well, for starters, the black suit theme is easily one of the coolest in the series, which I will talk about more when I get our first look at the suit. The Sandman theme is also pretty entertaining, but not as good as the black suit or Venom themes in my opinion. I just found it far too sinister, which did not fit the character we were given on screen. The black suit and Venom themes feel far more appropriate, while also sounding kick-ass, so good job. I don't think this film has a better score than the second film necessarily, as much of that film's score was lifted and recreated, or just flat out copied into this movie. Most notably the recreation of the main Spider-Man theme for the final battle mix, but I'll talk about that more when I get to it. All in all, the opening credits were alright, but nowhere near as enticing as the second or first films. So the movie starts with a scene of Peter swinging through the city as Spider-Man, which then ends up being a propaganda piece used to welcome people to Manhattan, home of the Spider-Man. Now while it might seem like a cool addition to these motion pictures to have Spider-Man be openly embraced by the city instead of on the odd occasion after he has saved their lives, it does fly right in the face of the last two films' semi-consistent message that Spider-Man is disliked by the city. He's a vigilante, a public menace, openly despised by the town's biggest newspaper, or at least the former largest, a wanted criminal for the suspected murder of Norman Osborn, a sworn enemy of Harry Osborn, one of the wealthiest men in the city, and would likely be hated by a large number of the city's denizens who disapprove of his methods. Or so you would think. Despite my little ramble there, this scene is actually pretty consistent with what we have been shown in the previous films. Spider-Man is very much treated like a celebrity, from having fangirls swoon over him as he swings away, to being applauded for his bravery by a handful of interviewed civilians, praised as a hero by J. Jonah Jameson in his quiet moment of reflection, as well as being thoroughly ignored by the police in both movies. You honestly expect me to believe this little half-assed attempt at an arrest is supposed to count? It is actually sort of commendable that this film just accepted the fact that Spider-Man isn't this wanted criminal, even if it does fly in the face of one of the series' main plot elements. But oh well. Tough titty! Let's just watch the pretty colors, why don't we? As Peter continues to monologue to himself about the state of his relationship with the city, we get the sense that Peter has become a little vain, a trait which shows itself more clearly as the movie progresses. This has always been a big criticism from fans of the series, as people think it goes against Peter's character to, essentially, enjoy the spotlight, along with what he does to MJ, but I'll save that for when I get there. Most people seem to think that this iteration of Peter wouldn't care for the fame, that his desire to help people is the reason he became Spider-Man, which we know isn't true, but such is life. And to be quite honest, I don't agree with the sentiment. After all the shit that Peter has gone through, as well as After all of the shit Peter has gone through, as well as all the heartache and pain that came with it, he deserves a little appreciation. He deserves to feel valued. There's nothing wrong with Peter being happy that he's receiving the recognition worthy of his merit. If only he hadn't caused a lot of that heartache and drama. Oh well, I'm sure nobody saw that. There is also the sense that the city is a little bit more grateful towards Spider-Man after seeing the difference he makes in the crime statistics while he's gone, as well as being the only person to stop Doc Ock. If only there was this extremely useful method of stopping people at a distance with next to no chance of harming yourself. And if only the police carried a device that would allow them the ability to accomplish this goal on them at all times. Maybe Spider-Man wouldn't need to be the city's last line of defense against calamari. Ah, but silly me, none of this is a criticism towards this picture. Just a friendly reminder of how much Spider-Man 2 sucked. It's actually better for the film just to move past these issues. The idea that Peter is being celebrated for doing something no one else could is a lot cooler if that were actually true. So Peter is now consistently on time for school instead of being late and almost failing because of his responsibilities. I suppose this might be because he now has MJ to help pick up some of the slack in terms of finances, leaving him more time to make his classes. Perhaps it has to do with Peter having a better grasp on his life, being capable of properly managing his time, which is naturally a skill you get better with at with time. Nevertheless, I'm just glad we don't have to start the film with Peter's situation being comically terrible again, so good job. We also get a mild introduction to Gwen Stacy, who comic book fans would recognize as the one bitch who got a neck snapped. The rest of us were like, who dis? She look haga wag, I mean pretty. She does get a better introduction during the crane accident scene, so it's a bit odd to have her here for no good reason, unless it's meant to establish they have some sort of chemistry together. And yet, even in college, as a grown-ass man, Peter is still being bullied by people for some fucking reason. I haven't been to college, but I assumed interactions between students were more like this.
Oh no! Oh no! Oh no! Oh no! Oh yeah!
And less like this.
That the energy levels are perturbed by the electric field.
But oh well, artistic license and whatnot.
Feel the power of the sun!
Why the fuck does Shang-Chi over here have what appears to be a mouth mirror? How does Doc Connors not notice him raising it to shine into Peter's face while looking right in his direction? What the fuck? After that short college scene, we have Peter standing in front of a pawn shop looking at used rings, very clearly with the intent of proposing to MJ. I wonder if Peter ever told MJ that he peeped on her through the windows as a teenager. I wonder if she ever told him she did the same thing after he got bitten. Details, man. They are important. We then get a scene where Peter goes to see MJ's play, but instead of an extremely unnecessary scene of him staring into a mirror and reflecting on his choices with a fairly cringy song selection, we just have him pitch up. On time, no less. And to add onto the list of improvements, we find that MJ saved him a ticket instead of forcing him to buy one for himself. Well, that was a nice thing for you to do, MJ. What happened? Did your heart grow 3 times its size since our last encounter? Did you realize you wouldn't melt if you stood in the rain? Whatever the case may be, it's refreshing to see a caring and understanding MJ once again, being more in line with her character from the first film, doing something for someone else just because she can, instead of forcing them to meet her requirements. Clap, clap, Miss Watson! I'll be honest, when I first saw this scene of the two gentlemen sitting down next to Peter, I thought we were going to get a reincarnation of the scene from X-Men 3 where the movie Bob stand-in shrunk himself before he sat down. Don't ask me why I thought this as a kid. I'll probably respond with something silly like, "Thy mother is fat," or something mature such as, "Thy father is obese." Let's move on. Also, this big Chungus cosplayer needs to stop blinking so frequently. You don't notice it initially, but once you do, you can't stop seeing it and it's just super fucking distracting. God! Anyway, after the play we have Peter meeting up with Harry, who also attended, and telling him that he needs to explain his actions, with Harry responding,
"Tell it to my father. Raise him from the dead."
Meaning that in all of this time, Peter never had a conversation with Harry in order to come to a mutual understanding on their relationship, as well as never attempting to resolve unmended connections between them after Harry discovered his identity at the end of Spider-Man 2. Now, it is never stated how long it has been since the events of 2, but according to marvelmovies.fandom.com, the film is set in 2005, a few months to a full year after Otto's demise at the docks, meaning that for almost a full year, Peter has refused to explain himself to Harry about what happened that night in 2002, which is just fucking great to think about, ain't it? Apparently Peter cared so little about the relationship, so little about the closure Harry had over his father, so little about how this dodo extinction level event impacted another person's life, that he willingly ignored him for an entire year, only bothering to attempt contact after squatting his jeans thanks to his girlfriend's singing voice. One might go as far as to say this lack of empathy and unwillingness to amend broken connections is an outright assassination of Peter's character. I wonder if we will see any more of that as we continue. Peter's also failed to communicate what happened between Harry and himself to MJ, whom he has been dating for a year now, who knows of his secret identity, who knows about how much Harry hates Spider-Man, who knows about the fact that Spider-Man was involved in the death of Norman Osborn, whether innocent or not. MJ also considers Harry to be her friend, so the fact that she doesn't even attempt to confront him about their current situation, despite knowing that Harry has been mourning his father's death for almost 3 years, is absolutely majestic, isn't it? The fact that she doesn't even ask Peter about it makes me think they were both sipping from the amnesia water again over the last 3 years. At least it's consistent with her character from the first film. But what about Harry himself? Should he have tried to contact Peter and resolve their pineapple and pizza or heresy beef himself? Should he have gone to MJ and asked her to help him rectify this ongoing moral dilemma with Peter? No. I don't think he should do anything, honestly. In this situation, it is completely all on Peter to cast the first stone and approach him. Peter has been the one holding secrets. Peter has been the one denying Harry any form of closure regarding his father's passing. Peter was the one who disrobed Norman and carried his naked body into Harry's home. All Harry ever did was ask Peter to help him identify who Spider-Man was so he could make him pay. There was nothing in the first film to outright imply he meant to cause Spider-Man bodily harm, but rather that he faced justice for his actions. The second film is the culprit in question, taking this desire one step further, but considering whenever he approached Peter, he never got a straightforward answer and felt betrayed by his lack of trust and understanding, I can acknowledge a desire to not want to do that anymore being built up over time. I don't think Harry conducted himself well, and I have 2 whole videos explaining my feelings on those matters. But considering he was the one to engage first every time, I definitely feel Peter should be the one to pick up the torch and ask Harry instead of the other way around. Let's just ignore the part where he aided a known terrorist in almost nuking the city. He wasn't himself without his Snickers bar. A scene that exemplifies my point probably the best is actually a deleted scene from the 2.1 cut of the film, where Harry and Peter have a dialogue that isn't the cinematic equivalent of burnt sandals on scrambled eggs. And you definitely get a better feel for how Harry observes their relationship to be currently.
Peter, don't you understand how I feel? I want this guy dead. The same way you want the guy who killed your Uncle Ben dead.
Harry says he wants Spider-Man dead and tries to appeal to the same sense of revenge Peter has for his uncle's killer, relying on him sharing a similar history, but with only one difference. Uncle Ben's killer is dead. It is at this point where I think Peter should have spoken to Harry about who he really is, because Peter knows just how violent this dark desire can become, and would likely not wish this for his friend. However, this is technically a different continuity, so take this with a grain of salt, but considering how valid this point holds even when applied to the standard version, I think I'm safe to use it. Harry gets in the car and drives off, leaving Peter in the dust. Is this Best Musical winner 2005 Tony Award confirmation the film is set in likely late 2005, or is this simply a minor inconsistency with the actual setting of the film? Not an issue, just a question. After that uneasy reunion, we are reintroduced to MJ behind the stage after her performance. At this point, we face our first major divergence in the series since the start of Spider-Man 2. The dialogue between MJ and Peter is good? Yeah, I know, I'm shocked too. Their dialogue in the scene not only encapsulates the sort of dialogue they shared in the first film, but is also a good demonstration of how they would likely interact with each other as a couple considering their personalities. Peter's a goofball who tries to over-explain things when a simple answer would be effective enough. Can relate. And MJ is straight to the point, but adores Peter for being such a nerd, smiling and giggling at how he describes the play to her. It's a cute scene for the 2 actors and a return to form from the first film. Perhaps now I can wash the taste of Spider-Man 2 MJ out of my mouth. Following that reunion, we have a scene of Harry emerging out of a vapor chamber filled with gobby juice, signaling to the audience that a new Goblin has arrived on the block. We also get shown a progression of the helmet and glider technology as we evolve from the first iterations to the last, showing the audience how far these films have come since 2002. Which is neat, but also gives you an insight into what Harry prioritized in his design philosophy, leaning more towards combat, adaptability, and stealth, instead of whatever the fuck this design was supposed to be. It also just makes me wonder how long he spent working on this tech. Now, I initially thought that the time skip between these 2 films was a total of 3 years instead of 1. This made me think that Harry had enough time to believably perfect the Goblin serum to avoid insanity like his father before him, as well as studying and altering the glider technology to create this more refined hoverboard which surpasses the glider in adaptability and agility. Very useful features when combating Spider-Man. The reason why I say it was believable that it took him this long is because Harry was never a science whiz. He struggled in high school, relying on Peter to assist him passing the year, as well as paying scientists to do their own experiments despite being the head of special projects, unlike his father who helped design and build the glider in addition to the serum. And even though he was extremely motivated to kill Spider-Man and would likely spend an absurd amount of time in his lair doing this work, it makes sense it would take him longer than someone like Peter or Norman, as he is not a genius by trade, but became one out of necessity and strong desire for revenge. This would all work well enough for me had the time between these films been 3 years, however due to the fact that this film is set 1 year after MJ kicked John in the metaphorical flirt, I do not think the amount of time given to Harry to reverse engineer and study this technology, even with the help of schematics, is enough for me to believe this was the result. Harry is definitely motivated enough to want to become the hobgoblin that we see, however he simply lacks the necessary skills to acquire his revenge. He isn't some prodigy science whiz, he he isn't gifted with intelligence, he hasn't worked on this machine for years and studied how it functions, and he doesn't have a degree in electrical engineering so grand it allows him to magic away sci-fi bullshit. The only way I could see this working is if he worked on the glider tech exclusively along with maybe the arm-mounted blades and sword, while simply taking a risk with the serum and hoping that it doesn't turn him insane. To be fair, considering how self-destructive his life has become and how isolated his goal of killing Spider-Man is, this simple oversight does appear to be within his character, so I am fine with him not experimenting further on the serum. However, with that said, I do have some questions in regards to this operation he has going in his secret lab, and it is a matter of logistics. How exactly did he get all of the extra materials needed to build the serum chamber, along with all the necessary electrical installations without raising suspicion? Did he do it himself within the last year? Did he bribe someone to build it without elevating questions? Did Oscorp not maybe lead an investigation into Harry's desire to acquire schematics for the chamber, as well as other possible utensils related to the Green Goblin incident? I am willing to say this is a far more believable set of circumstances than what we got dealing with Ock in the last film, considering here, Harry has access to his own financials, as well as being the head of special projects, which would likely come with its own benefits. Not to mention there is also the possibility of Norman having copies of the experiment blueprints and other glider-related technologies within the secret room, especially since we see multiple vials of the Green Goblin serum on both ends of the wall, so it is likely he was trying to replicate the experiment during the months of isolation throughout Spider-Man 1. Norman was also CEO of the company before being asked for his resignation, so it is believable enough for me to say he simply had enough power in the company to move shipments of these materials to his home without raising suspicion. Either way, it doesn't make any particular difference, since no matter how Harry did this, it is still far more believable that he had the income and resources necessary to build this lair than it is for how Otto managed to build his reactor in the last film. It also makes more sense than a few other Spider-Man movies, but we aren't allowed to compare the worst Raimi film to these beloved pieces of incredibly well-written, character-driven stories. Our soft boy escapism movies are not to be trifled with. Following that scene, we met up with Peter and MJ hanging out on a web in New York Central Park, looking up at the night sky as they see shooting stars. Now, the pessimist in me would like to ask how likely it is that they are able to set up on that web without being spotted by any pedestrians casually walking by. The optimist in me, however, is glad that question was asked, because apparently New York Central Park is 3.41 kilometers squared or 843 acres large, including sweeping lanes, picturesque woodlands, meandering streams, and broad lakes, at least according to centralparknyc.org. Along with these rather luscious experiences of the countryside, additional features were added after the park's creation in 1858, including baseball and football fields, 2 ice rinks, a carousel, a zoo, formal gardens, commemorative monuments, and finally concerts and theatre venues. 150 years after its opening, the park still serves the essential purpose of offering urban dwellers of the city an experience of the countryside, an escape from the stresses of the city life and a way to commune with nature and fellow New Yorkers to more than 42 million visitors a year. And before you ask, no, this video was not sponsored by the Central Park of New York. This was just a long-winded way for me to say, shut up, it's fine. If they went deep enough into the park, I highly doubt New Yorkers would find them, especially since this is late at night and most people tend to walk alongside the many winding paths built into the park. 58 to be specific, at least according to centralpark.org. All Peter and MJ needed to do is avoid them, which shouldn't be that difficult. You also have to take into account how late it is at night. According to londontheatre.co.uk, most plays and musicals are traditionally 2.5 hours long, including intervals, generally starting at around 8:30 PM. Some plays can go on for longer, reaching as much as 4 hours in length, but for simplicity's sake and considering this is such a minor point, I will keep it to 2.5, meaning that if MJ was ready to go as soon as the play had ended, they would have left at just after 11 PM on what we can assume to be a Friday night. According to centralparktours.net, the almost 840 acres of land tends to be rather empty at night, which is attributed to there being so many other late night venues to partake in, especially in the theatre district, claiming that much of the charm of Central Park is to be found during the daytime. So yeah, as I said, long-winded. Anywho, now out of every single convenience we have witnessed in the Raimi trilogy so far, I do in fact think this is the most egregious example of it. This meteorite containing the symbiote, which would later become the Black Suit as well as a main villain, just so happened to land next to the one person on the planet who has the ability to mimic a perfect Spider-Man themed moveset needed to create Venom. It just so happened to land on this spot, on this night, at this time, when Peter was right there with a moped ready to move it to a different location. It also just so happens to be the perfect substance needed to push Peter to become his evil, more memey alter ego, and is responsible for a large number of the most important events of this movie. Instead of being brought in from space inside a shuttle like another Sony movie, we have this bullshit. Instead of someone like, oh, I don't know, John Jameson becoming the symbiote carrier, taking revenge on the two people who wronged him in the last movie, we get the most convenient plot starting point since Rey and Finn running into a fully functional Millennium Falcon. Awesome. It's especially hilarious to think about when you realize that 90 to 95% of all meteors burn up in the atmosphere before managing to land on the surface below. So this fucking thing is incredibly lucky to have survived the trip, considering how much he detests fire.
Oh, hot, 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 hot! Hot, 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 hot!
But oh well, time to zoom into the next scene. Next we are introduced to Flint Marco, aka the Sandman. Or he will be eventually. He has just escaped from prison and is on the run from authorities. How did he escape? I don't know, and the movie doesn't explain it. However, in this case, I don't think an explanation is warranted, as it isn't really that important to know. What is important is wondering why the police didn't arrive here immediately, especially since they know Flint is very attached to his daughter. Seems like the obvious first place to look, but hey, it's not like the police are competent in the series, so whatever. Flint, man, you couldn't just use a knife? Also, like, you see what condition they are living in, right? You really think it was a good idea to take some of whatever little food they have? Damn, dog. I will say that Flint's initial scene with his family is a bit of a mixed bag for me, honestly. The dialogue they deliver doesn't come off as very natural, and it's just some standard exposition the audience likely figured out already by this point. How do we know Flint is an escaped convict? Well, we see him running away from the police in prison garments. How do we know his family is poor? They live in a rundown apartment and barely have any food. How do we know his daughter is sick? Have you seen this fucking thing? I mean, I understand why Flint felt it was necessary to tell his daughter he would get her healthy again, and I get the frustration the mom must be feeling for being put into this situation, but they honestly could have done more with this scene. Maybe leave some of the dialogue alone and trust the audience can figure out what they are shown on their own, but besides that, the scene is fairly harmless. Moving on. What do Aunt May's first scene and Uncle Ben in the swimsuit have in common? They are both knockouts. Great stuff. Alright, we have finally arrived at the scene I've been wanting to talk about since the first video, and that's because it confuses me. In Spider-Man 1, Peter's spider sense was already inconsistent, but its main function was to warn him of incoming danger, with varying levels of time before the damage arrived. Sometimes it was an instant before being hit, sometimes it was several seconds before the danger even revealed itself, and others it never happened. In Spider-Man 2 it worked fairly similarly, even being as inconsistent as the first movie, but there were never instances where he was capable of detecting danger from far away. It was always an instant before he was harmed. And in this movie, the first instance of danger he faces warrants zero reaction from his Peter tingle. Why is that? Is it because it's inconsistent? Is it because his mind is somewhere else? Or is it because the immediate action of Hobgoblin wasn't one on which could cause physical harm? I have no idea, because if the danger was present, then he should have reacted. However, if his spider sense deemed it safe, then of course it wouldn't warn him, right? And if that were the case, is this something Harry could figure out and prepare for? Because if he didn't know about the spider sense, then what was stopping him from shooting Peter with a rocket, or his flamethrower, or simply cutting his head off? Did he want to fist Peter? Well, no, because he immediately tries cutting him with the arm blades. Does he want to torture Peter? Well, no, because his actions seem to show him possessing a desire to instantly kill him, such as his sword plunging attack. So then that begs the question, does Harry know about Peter's spider sense, and if so, does he know how to counter it? The movie doesn't outright say that he does, but many of his actions rely on attacking Peter in an unexpected moment. Not to mention that if he does know, then the movie absolutely needs to show how he figured that out, as well as how he planned to counter it. But sadly, we don't get an answer, so booey gooey, this should just be my default setting at this point. But I will say, the start of this fight is fucking cool, and that's because both parties behave competently. Peter has just been surprise attacked and doesn't know who the assailant is, so his first response is to put some distance between them and attack from range so as to avoid the arm blades. Harry then reacts to this by severing the line instead of engaging further, although it doesn't really make sense how Peter doesn't just let go of the web and shoot out another one. It might be due to him trying to figure out how he's going to continue the fight, as he's never had to deal with a flying opponent before, and the fact he goes for a tumble confuses me, as he's been swinging for years. Surely he would be capable of handling himself much better. Whatever. Perhaps he is suffering from a concussion or some form of head trauma. Harry did put his face through several buildings.
Harry, you knew this was coming, Pete. Listen to me. I didn't kill your father. He was trying to kill me. He killed himself.
My, Peter, imagine if you tried doing this earlier, would have avoided a few unnecessary fresh scars. And yes, it does seem a bit strange that Harry wouldn't flinch at the idea Norman tried to kill Peter, but after having to deal with this massive lie for years of his life from someone he considered his best friend, I'm more than okay with Harry being overcome with anger and not caring what excuses Peter has to save his skin. However, some of you might be questioning why I haven't pointed out how slow Harry is to attack Peter here. Why does he slowly and menacingly approach Peter in order to show his face, instead of taking out his sword and plunging it into his heart? Well, the read I got from this scene was that Harry wanted Peter to know it was him that was about to end his life, as he spent his final moments to regret of his decisions. This is reflective of what he tried to do in Spider-Man 2 before finding out who was behind the mask, so I'm more than okay with him sharing the same courtesy for Peter in this scene. I also have reason to believe that this punch from Harry would seriously fucking hurt as it goes through a concrete wall. And Pete is very anxious to get out of the way. This is the exact same serum which made Spider-Man bleed a few films ago. He'd likely know that his endurance could only take so much damage before he was powerless to stop any more advances from Harry. So I'm okay with Harry going for the punch instead of the blades here, especially since he seems to use it as a last resort when his other methods of attack can't be as effective. There is also the personal element of experiencing the sensation of Peter's bones breaking through his own arm, which I can imagine is something Harry wanted to endure for a long time. But feel free to disagree with me if you think he should have used the blade alternatively. This is a very impressive fight for the most part. Harry is a strong counter to Peter's abilities. He is more mobile, he hits just as hard, he is capable of neutralizing Peter's only mode of transport, and is very likely faster than he is in terms of travel speed. Peter really has no way of fighting back, and so he has to rely on keep-away tactics and outsmarting his opponent. A rather unique method of fighting for this character, as every fight he has had so far has been reliant on fists instead of smarts. It's a nice change. But don't let that fool you. Harry is smart in his own right. He is constantly changing up his methods of attack, as well as consistently being aggressive. When he can close the gap, he uses bladed weapons basically instantly. He prevents Peter from swinging in open spaces and forces him into a narrow corridor where he again has the advantage of ranged weapons that do a good job at harming Peter. This is hands down the best fight in the series so far. Quite frankly, it seems like the victory only went to Peter due to his experience in fights, something I'm sure Harry doesn't have a lot of, but even still an impressive effort nonetheless. I also think I know why Harry doesn't use his missiles or flamethrower, but this is reliant on an idea that Harry cares about the safety of civilians, which hasn't been properly established, especially in the last film. However, considering his change of heart at the end of this motion picture, I think it is fair to make this inference. The inference being that he doesn't use the missiles to avoid harming people, obviously. The second in regards to the flamethrower ability is that it simply was just too slow to hit Spider-Man. The reason why it works on Sandman in the finale is because he is a much bigger target and thus harder to miss, so Harry can risk using the ability. Peter, on the other hand, would more than likely see the attack coming and dodge it, leaving Harry wide open to a counterattack. And judging by how well Harry conducts himself in this fight, I do think it is fair to say this was something he took into account, but please feel free to make your own assessment. I'd also like to discuss Harry's design as the Hobgoblin because quite frankly I think it looks really neat. As a substitute to the over-the-top Power Rangers-esque design of the original Goblin suit, we have a slicker, more combat-ready depiction. His clothes are completely black to help with the idea of blending into the concrete jungle instead of standing out in a crowd, and matches well with the overall aesthetic of this dark Avenger. And speaking of blending in, this madman actually did it. He surprisingly managed to create a glider design which didn't generate noise pollution, allowing police officers and Spider-Man to know where he is coming from. This is an objective improvement over the initial Goblin glider in terms of allowing him to be stealthier. If Norman possessed this hoverboard in the first film, then I could buy him sneaking up on JJ. The board is also capable of traveling in two different methods, the standard glider routine and the newly added surfboard method, allowing him to travel between narrow gaps in buildings, making Spider-Man's time fighting him significantly harder. We also see the sword on Harry's back before he even pulls it out, meaning we don't get scenes of Norman summoning the Wrath of Poseidon in order to get a trident. The addition of the wrist blade also makes him far more deadly to face at close quarters, with the sword allowing him more reach while still remaining just as lethal. His design screams practicality to me without seeming too edgy. It's just the right amount of cool. Moving on. Yeah, no, that ring is long gone, especially considering how far they flew away. There's no way Peter's catching this ring before it hits the ground. Neat visual and all, but it doesn't make sense. I also imagine Harry was trying to gut Peter again, similar to the first time, but unfortunately Peter managed to counter this attack by shooting Harry in the face with his webs. A tactic we haven't seen fully utilized since the first film, so good job, Peter. Oh neat, Harry installed a sort of target locator on his hoverboard which can find Harry once he gets off the board. Would have been a neat thing for Norman to have in his film, so I'm glad this was something he thought of. I wonder if Peter disrobed Harry before bringing him to the hospital, similar to what he did with Norman, or if he just brought him there like that, arm blade and all. Is it a fair inference to say he simply took off any ambiguous items before arriving here, which doesn't seem like it would be a lot? I mean, possibly. We don't see what happens during the trip, only that he got Harry where he needed to be. We can assume he swung to the hospital since it's faster than waiting for an ambulance, and Peter doesn't have a cell phone, making it seem like the best option at his disposal. So to be fair to the film, I'm simply going to say he took off the arm blade along with any potential suspicious items just before entering the hospital, and that he was able to give a reasonable explanation for how this happened. Moving on. After the confrontation, we get a scene of Captain Stacy receiving a progress report on the recapture of Flint Marco from his unnamed underling. It's cute that the film tries to implement the police more frequently, but it doesn't mean it was done well. Still, appreciate the effort. It's a lot more than anything the previous installations attempted. We follow this up with Marco running away from the police in the marshlands as they chase him with guns and dogs. Is there a reason why the cops don't shoot him here? The police have already tied him to the Ben Parker homicide, so they have a reason to suspect he is dangerous. And according to CBC.ca, state and federal law allows the use of deadly force to prevent the escape if the officer believes the suspect possesses a significant threat. Well, there might actually be a reason. According to the same site, Maria Halberfield, head of the Law and Police Science Department at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, said, "You cannot shoot any fleeing felon, but you certainly can shoot the one who possesses a real threat." This was in reference to David Sweat, an escaped killer who was running into a forest before being shot in the back. Sweat was unarmed, but according to the site, he was already responsible for killing a police officer and was accomplices with another escapee who was found with a 20-gauge shotgun after he was shot and killed by officers. So there was a precedent to believe that Sweat was also armed and dangerous. Unlike both of these men, Flint had never killed any officer, nor did he have a weapon, so I think under the circumstances it makes sense for the police not to immediately open fire on him despite being an escapee. So these scientists are just going to perform this experiment without even bothering to look out of the window right in front of them to see what was the human-shaped creature that just rolled out onto the testing ground in line of their field of vision.
Okay.
Also, Flint, buddy, pal, amigo, what are you doing just standing there? Why didn't you even attempt to move out of the sandcastle? Are you currently being mind controlled by Charles Xavier? Cause if not, then I can't explain why you were just standing there. I don't know how Flint's DNA somehow starts becoming sand, but considering this is sci-fi bullshit, I'm not going to care too much about it. I will say the CGI for this molecularization looks pretty good, so props to the people involved who were responsible for making Sandman look as acceptable as he does. As Sandman gets blasted to the negative zone, we cut back to Peter in the hospital. A doctor approaches him and informs him that Harry is awake, but he has suffered a mild case of short-term memory loss, going back as far as the first film. My, isn't that fucking convenient? Means now Peter can continue being the piece of shit he's been since the end of the first film. Oh, but just you wait on that one, trust me, it's going to be grand. But in regards to Harry's amnesia, well, is it really that bad? According to betterhealth.vic.gov, concussions and other forms of head trauma can lead to cases of memory loss, both short-term and long-term, with loss of memory being either permanent or temporary depending on the case. This falls in line with what we are shown on screen and makes enough sense from a real-world viewpoint, at least when accounting for the fact that this is a film and films tend to glorify or over-enhance how aspects of the real world function. But this film doesn't seem to take it to such an outlandish degree, especially in comparison to the first two films. According to the same website, concussion, seizures, and electroconvulsive therapy seem to temporarily disrupt the electrical activity of the brain and prevent the short-term memory from working properly. With treatment of this form of amnesia requiring rest... Fuck off! With treatment of this form of amnesia requiring rest once all other... Oh, I had it, Jesus. With treatment of this form of amnesia requiring rest once all other complications have been ruled out, again lining up pretty accurately with what the film depicts. However, in saying that, I don't think the most people's issues with the scene is that it is unrealistic, but rather that it plays to the tropes of amnesia in films and TV. Memory is typically seen as a lazy way of resolving or creating conflict due to how much easier it is than to actually write an interesting means of doing either naturally. Since Harry isn't depicted as an antagonist for almost half of the film, this would naturally fall in line with that issue. Although considering that the presence of drama between Harry and Peter never actually goes away, and Harry is depicted as an ominous figure and Peter Peter's life several times before getting his memory back, I can't consciously agree to the criticism of his memory loss being an issue. His concussion is believable and lines up with the real world, resulting from an unfortunate accident during the middle of a battle, which if you don't recall tends to lead to injuries. Harry is also in the ill-fated position of occupying the same space as 3 other antagonists, so attempting to keep him as a relevant opposition to Peter without completely writing him out of the film seems like a legitimate idea to me. The benefit of giving Harry amnesia is also that it allows the audience to build back up a sense of how likable Harry should have been before his father's death, showcasing his friendship with Peter and his charisma with MJ, which creates a believable romantic confrontation between our 3 main leads. It also means his death in the finale has more impact because now, instead of seeing a dismal twit from the last film biting the dust, we have an actual character with a modicum of development making a valiant sacrifice to save his best friend from a fatal wound. Ah, but amnesia bad, super stinky, me no likey, whatever. The Sandman forming scene is just beautiful. It's a well-crafted scene with amazing direction and music. Every movement of his body requires tons of effort, which we can see as he struggles to put himself back together, forcing himself to become used to his new body as he starts forming more complex features such as fingers. Also that he can hold his necklace, holding a memento of his daughter, the only item on him to survive the demolecularization, a daily reminder of what his mission in life is. It's a touching scene with a lot of emotion and turns Flint into more of a compelling character because we as the audience are able to sympathize with him and his goal. However, I will say that the change in intensity for the music is a bit off-putting for me personally, as the sinister feeling it gives off doesn't fit well with the character we have been shown so far. I think it would have worked better had we seen Sandman behaving more morally ambiguous, such as when he attacks the police as a sand monster. The music is forming him as a villain prematurely instead of the force of nature he really should be at this stage. It's a minor gripe but a stain on an otherwise great scene. But now we have to start asking questions again, and we know how fun those are when dissecting films. Why is his daughter's memento the only item which survived? During the scene where he falls into the pit, he is still clearly shown wearing the necklace, so I can't say it simply fell off of him as a defense. And his necklace is fairly important to the scene because it gives him the determination to start forming more complex features such as fingers, legs, and eventually Thomas Hayden Church.
Jesus, kid, how'd you draw that shit detail?
The best faith argument I could give here is that this machine only converts organic matter such as flesh and bone along with his clothing, which I'm going to have to assume is organic, and that metallic items such as the necklace and belt buckle simply fell into the sand. We never see a belt buckle in the sand, so I can't say this for certainty, and he forms his own buckle along with the rest of his clothing, but I always took this scene to mean he simply formed an image of how he perceived himself before the change, which would include things like his shoes and belt. I'm not really going to put too much stock into this point since the token was just a reminder of the goal he already had the night before, but it is a bit silly. Moving on. This moment is probably the most bearable scene of Peter trying to help MJ with her career. He is trying to relate to a situation and make her feel better by using his own experience as an example of how she should treat her situation. Not something to be upset by, and is something I have done myself, so I understand the logic. MJ doesn't approve though and feels like Peter isn't listening to her problems, asking him to try and understand how she feels. Now I could be snarky and mention her behavior from the second movie, but I've already made peace with the fact that this is an entirely different character, so I will attempt to make as few references to bitchy MJ as possible. Quite frankly, her request is reasonable enough. She just wants someone to talk to who will listen to her plights. Peter, being the dork that he is, tries to help her instead of listening to her, which frustrates her. I know it's weird, but you see, I have known a few women before and they do behave like this. Jokes aside, I do get where she is coming from. Sometimes you just want to vent without calling 911 about your issues, something Peter is trying to understand.
Ever since Archer came back, things have been weird with Robert.
Aw, trouble in Billionaireadise?
No, hey, no. I love being married.
It's just that...
he's constantly telling me how to handle Archer, and I'm like, I know how to handle Archer, buddy, okay? I handled him for years before I met you, and maybe, just maybe, I want to complain about the guy without you trying to fix it!
So this place has bungalows?
This scene doesn't have any issues that I can tell, but rather a list of things people can misinterpret or misunderstand. I'm just doing my best to give an accurate account of what is happening. This scene also introduces us to an important piece of equipment, the police radio. This handy little device allows Peter to listen into police radio chatter in order to hear about any crimes in progress, which allows him the ability to make it to scenes before police as often as he can. I initially thought this device was introduced in Spider-Man 2 because otherwise it would make no sense to how he arrives at crimes before police unless they happen near him, like they do anyways in that film. But it seems the idea to introduce it in Spider-Man 2 was there, as it appears in a deleted scene from the 2.1 cut. Odd that they removed such a useful scene, but then again, that was part of the course for that film. However, back to this movie. The radio gets used multiple times during this flick's runtime, most notably when Peter's trying to hunt down Flint Marco. It would also be useful in aiding Peter in his homework, as it would require him to go on fewer and fewer patrols, making his life infinitely easier. I think I just figured out why it was removed from the film's prequel. Nonetheless, it's a minor addition, but one with metric tons of benefit. Although, now that I am viewing the scene, I just realized something. Peter and MJ haven't moved in together. This apartment of Peter's only ever seems to be occupied by him, and MJ only seems to visit him from time to time. I'd think that MJ would have insisted on Peter coming to live with her, especially since in the last film she said,
"Peter, I can't survive without you."
Not to mention they have been together for presumably a year, so moving in seems like an obvious next step, at least before marriage. And considering that she is already saving him tickets, it seems likely she'd want to help him with his finances somewhat, at least enough that he doesn't need to live in a room where doors jam and desk drawer knobs break off. Perhaps she would only be willing to have him move in after he proposes. In the last film we only saw MJ and John in the same home after his engagement party, so there does appear to be some sort of precedent set for this. I wouldn't consider this a flaw, but rather a strange choice from a writing perspective. Only issue I can see with this is that Peter isn't present in MJ's home when Harry breaks in, meaning his confrontation on the bridge doesn't happen. I don't think the diner scene is as badly affected because he likely could have stayed with Aunt May's for the night or bunked with Harry. Also, minor side note, but I would have severely appreciated it if MJ said, "Don't give me the horse shit," instead of what we got, because I would have faded from reality laughing. Oh well, next scene. As we progress onwards with the film, we are greeted with an instance of an overhead crane malfunctioning as its cargo is vigorously spiraling towards a building in front of it.
Never mind, there's fine as wine Bryce Dallas Howard, who doesn't do much but get flustered and sweaty and make my trousers feel 2 sizes too small. Hey, I'm only human. Have you seen the faces she pulls?
I'm disappointed in your species.
Oh, I don't know how that got in yet. Might need to have a word with my editor. Miss Howard's performance in this film, despite looking drop-dead gorgeous, isn't really much to fawn over, as she plays a typical third-party love interest you see in any other teenage drama flick. Her standout moment is actually this scene, but that's just because every other one is just bleh.
So sorry.
That debris definitely killed someone, which is going to cause problems in a few minutes.
Captain Stacy, they got some kind of short up there. They can't shut down the crane.
Get Edison on the phone. Have them kill the power to the whole block.
What is this? Competent police who do their jobs immediately instead of standing around gaping? And a captain who is giving orders out to his men? Did I put in the wrong movie? Is this a prank? Am I being punked? Whose idea was it to make the police competent in a Raimi movie? And we have people who react realistically to incoming danger instead of standing around like golfers waiting for their turn on a course? What in the Babu freaking fuck happened here? However, in saying that, I would have appreciated it if they decided to move sooner and maybe attempted to exit the building. But still, progress.
Who are you?
It's Brock, sir. Edward Brock Jr. I work at the Daily Bugle. And I'm dating your daughter.
Are you fucking serious?
Now, is it lucky that the crane missed her? Yes, but you see it shifting towards her left, so whatever. Is it lucky that none of the debris is hitting her? Not really. She was at the top of most of the debris and she was about to be squished if Spider-Man didn't save her. So basically what I'm saying is that we have an action scene that is functional in its execution and doesn't rely on too many illogical moments to create drama. It's a good scene and a really cool one at that. At least before Spider-Man drops off Gwen Stacy, because after that point it goes back to being stupid.
What the fuck are you doing?
Peter wastes his time talking to Eddy, played by Topher Grace, instead of climbing back up towards the crane to stop it from causing any more damage, or attempting to see if anyone was hurt either by the crane or the falling debris, or hell, just being useful to the cleanup crew. He just fucks off after dropping Gwen when there were many more people in harm's way. You had a good thing going and you blew it! I also think now is a good time for me to bring up a criticism I had for the first film regarding MJ recognizing Peter's voice as Spider-Man, just this time with Eddy. Peter makes no attempt to mask his voice. Before speaking to Eddy, whose first words to him are,
Now on, I am going to be taking shots at you for the bugle. So, smile. Are you smiling? Just kidding.
Now, sure, Peter might be a little puzzled as he processes this new information, but like, come on. Surely you'd be better at recognizing the need to mask your voice. The same goes for Gwen, but to a much lesser extent, as she is recovering from a near-death experience before crying into her dad's arms. I doubt she is thinking about who sounds like Peter. Oh well. We are finally introduced to JJ after going more than 30 minutes without seeing his majestic face. And they fucking nerfed him! Instead of the meme machine from the first two films, especially the second, he is now a person with issues. If turd could come in different flavors, this would be a gourmet prepared 3-course meal of bullshit. We also find out the Bugle isn't doing as good as other newspaper outlets, which then begs the question I raised in my other 2 Spider-Man videos. Technically 3, but whatever. Links in the description. And that is, why hasn't Peter moved on to other newspapers that pay better? Especially one that is selling more papers, and therefore would be more likely to afford his services. Is he loyal to the Bugle, despite going through all of the last movie as broke as a bum whose only difference between himself and a homeless man was that he had a job? He could still very easily be making even more cash by simply giving selfies of himself to multiple newspapers, since he is still technically a freelance photographer, much to Jameson's dismay. Besides that little slip in logic, I think the scene is mostly great. It's got charm, humor, decent dialogue which lines up with how our characters would behave. So good job. We also get some mild foreshadowing of how Peter loses his shit with Eddy as Toby's facial expressions showcase his annoyance and disbelief building up slowly throughout the scene. It's neat. Now I'd like to quickly just address Topher Grace and his portrayal of Eddy Brock, which I know has not been looked upon fondly by many a Spider-Man fan, who have compared him to other portrayals of the character, namely the comics and the 90s TV show. The most common complaint I see is that people don't think Topher pulled off the physical appearance of Eddy well enough, since Eddy was a big man, especially after he started working out, which was meant to contrast the more frail and fragile stature of Spider-Man by introducing a large and imposing nemesis. Someone who shared many of his key traits while also being physically superior, creating a greater challenge. And to be honest, I don't think this was fair of them to do. Topher's Eddy is meant to be a reflection of Peter, but one who is more confident in themselves. He is the same height, has the same taste in women, the same career path, but he is more driven. He is outgoing, energetic, persuasive, he says what's on his mind, an exact mirror or reflection of Peter without being an outright different being physically. He is what Peter would be if his personality was slightly altered, something we see explored briefly once Peter lets the black suit consume him. Even go as far as dating the same girl. Now most of people's issues with him have to do with arguments from adaptation, which have never really been something I took very seriously depending on the adaptation and the level of faithfulness. But since this character is set in a universe which itself is already very different from the source material, I don't quite understand why he was singled out so much. I feel like he should only really be judged as the character he is instead of what he was in another property, but hey, that's just me. And what do I think of Eddy in this movie? Well, I think he's fine, just fine. He's no standout villain like Defoe and Molina were, but he isn't awful. He serves his role well enough and he's acting as decent. His brief time as Venom isn't horrifying, in fact I think it's quite good, if a bit cringy at times. It seems like a decent portrayal of a man who received too much power too quickly and is seething with hatred. The symbiote also amplifies the negative traits of its host, and Eddy was always someone who craved attention, so it works just fine for me. Moving on. I will say this scene has probably the strangest use of the Stan Lee cameo, as some random stranger approaches Peter and gives him literally one line of vague dialogue. It was just such an odd addition which comes in the middle of 2 fairly important scenes, so why have it here? Weird. We follow this up with Peter taking Harry to his apartment, which reintroduces us to this serpent, welcoming him back home. Peter also gives Harry a homecoming present in the form of their old basketball, which gives us some neat backstory of how they spent their childhood, leading to them playing a mini-game in the hallways. Why is the movie with the best on-screen relationship between Harry and Peter the supposed worst one? Why is it the last one, for that matter? Why don't we spend more time doing this sort of thing? If we had scenes like this in either of the first 2 films, it would make scenes like the party confrontation interaction more impactful as we know what is at stake, more so than just flatmates breaking up. This film does a good job showing their friendship and how they would have interacted with each other had they hung out after school. It's a shame it came so late, but hey, better late than never. I also like how Harry's reaction to the ball hitting the vase isn't outlandish in its plausibility. I could easily imagine someone with half decent motor skills reacting in a similar manner, especially if they trained for any sporting events. We know why Peter is shocked to see this muscle memory being so refined, but Harry being pleasantly surprised by his motor functions and reaction timing while not being flabbergasted is a nice touch. It's a subtle way to show what is in store for these two men as their confrontation inevitably meets its end. Well, it would be subtle if the ominous music wasn't playing in the background, but anywho. You just can't help but feel bad for MJ in this instance. She has been routinely anxious in regards to her performance with little to no pushback from Peter, which then sets up why she doesn't tell him about being fired and confides in Harry, who listens. It also helps that Peter decided to be a dung beetle at the worst possible time, but this was likely going to happen anyways. I just find it odd that every single newspaper gave her a negative review. Wouldn't her lack of ability to be heard past the first row be something the directors could have picked up during rehearsals? Whatever, it'll be fine. How the hell did these people see Spidey swinging? Why do we need this role reversal of characters needing to be shat on by the universe for literally no reason? We could have had the scene of her being jealous during the awards ceremony when Pete received the key to the city, showing how poorly she is reacting in regards to Peter getting all of the spotlight when it was her dream to be seen on stage. Pair this up with a blatant slap in the face considering what Spider-Man decides to do with his face, and you have a scene which works well enough to properly express how MJ is feeling to the audience. Problem is, I don't think the kiss should be there. Let's discuss that more when we arrive there. Now, I was wondering how Gwen was planning on getting Spider-Man to attend the ceremony, but considering how much advertisement there is of him around the city, I think it's fine that he found out what's happening. Problems are, again, to do with logistics. When does the ceremony take place? Was Gwen planning this long before she was saved by Spider-Man and the ceremony just so happened to take place on the same day? Is this supposed to be a few days to weeks later as a sign of gratitude? No clue, and the movie doesn't tell you either, verbally or with the use of mise-en-scene to visually tell the audience that this ceremony was planned before Gwen was rescued. It would have been as simple as a billboard advertisement or even a character such as Gwen's father saying he thought she was preparing the arrangements for the ceremony during his one and only conversation with Eddy. I like doing my own investigations when watching films as I am a stickler for details, so I don't need a blatant clue that this was happening, but something subtle would have gone a long way to make the scene more believable.
Isn't that guy from that prison break?
He fits.
Hey, you! Halt!
Oh my goodness! Police who recognize wanted criminals as well as patrolling the streets? I think I'm gonna cook a nice steak.
Get your mind out of the gutter.
Fuck it.
Although this police officer attempting to kill Flint with a shovel is a bit of a strange one, I am still going to award brownie points for taking the initiative. Just not any actual points, because this is still a bad idea for cops to be doing. I'd also like to mention that I'm not a fan of the shaky cam being used on display. Every character appears in and out of focus far too quickly, which creates a sense of visual vertigo, and is honestly just not a welcomed addition to this quite frankly really well shot film. I understand it was a trend at this point because everyone wanted to be the next Jason Bourne, but this felt unnecessary. Oh yeah, I stand by my decision to have the Sandman theme appear here for the first time. The heavy and aggressive tone, likely due to the 8 very low French horns, makes him feel monstrous and accompanies the visuals perfectly. Paired up with his new Sandman voice and you have a fantastic antagonist for our main character, as well as just a really cool looking design for a supervillain. Fucking stellar rat.
This is something else.
And now I need to be a stickler again. How did Flint manage to figure out how to do this? It makes enough sense that he would try to form a body he was already familiar with, but to add more? To increase in size and to project your sand in such a manner that it would seem almost alien to you, seems like you'd need some practice first instead of getting it right the first time. Practice which likely was forgone due to him unfortunately being jam-packed in a film with 3 other antagonists at the same time. I understand Raimi initially only wanted Sandman and Harry, with the studio forcing him to add Venom, so he obviously wasn't working with a lot of time to develop these characters properly. And here's why I sound a bit like a contrarian. From my own personal opinion, as someone who has watched this film a few dozen times over the years, I think that Sandman as a character should have been saved for the 4th film, as well as not having his retcon of killing Uncle Ben taking place. The reason for this has to do with Peter as a character. This film seems to be wanting to explore his dark side, if you will, how he has allowed the fame of being Spider-Man to go to his head, and how easily he succumbed to revenge taking a hold of his life. He denounces most of his ties with his friends after his altercation with Harry, when a simple conversation between him, MJ, and even this cheeky fucker could have resolved so many things. So why doesn't he? However, that is a tangent I don't want to get into just yet, preferring to focus on the topic at hand and discussing that point at a later interval. But yes, this film takes a look into Peter as a character, what he values, what his deepest desires are, what prevents him from chasing them, and ultimately the consequences of getting what he wants and where that leaves him. I think a lot of his development was pretty rushed, with only segments of these ideas popping into the script, although I like the premise and think it should have been explored properly, along with what it could have meant for his character in a potential 4th film. And thus we come back to Sandman. Flint Marco is probably the most tragic individual in this film, or even out of any film in the series. His embroilment with the law is born out of a desire to help his daughter with a sickness he can't afford to cure. His transformation into Sandman is probably the most inhuman metamorphosis, and yet possesses the most emotionally human scene in the film. He is a character who could have had a lot more depth to him if he was given more time to develop, and a lot of that would have to do with his relationship with Spider-Man. My headcanon, if you will, is that after experiencing the power trip that the symbiote suit gave him, Peter would have had a better understanding of what it meant to be, well, himself. A person with a great sense of power and responsibility, and what that power could do if it wasn't kept in check. Because of this, Peter could probably empathize with Flint's situation far more than anyone, and instead of turning Sandman into a villain, we could have had an entire film of Spider-Man trying to help Flint rather than simply punching him for punching's sake. It could have been his 4-movie long arc, if you will, going from someone who became a vigilante out of guilt in order to honor his uncle's memory, to someone who couldn't accept both elements of his life and faltered in his responsibility, to someone who accepted his power but let it overwhelm him to the point it became harmful, and finally to someone who found balance in his life between his power and his responsibility, who decided to learn from his mistakes and be a genuine help to those he protected and he faced. I think that would have been a pretty neat idea, don't you? Tell me in the comments if you like this, or if I'm being full of shit and don't understand the character. Either way, I think it's good and that I should be moving on. And of course, the first person to be openly fired upon in these movies was a brown guy. Typical. Flint, if you could do this from the get-go, then why did you bother walking? Or did you not know you could do this until you absorbed more sand? And if you didn't know, then what made you try and do it? Bloody hell, just stop asking questions, Shandy. What the fuck is this? Genuinely good character interaction between supposed friends? I didn't know this was fucking allowed. Seriously, go back and see any of the interactions from the first movie, and none of it looks like this. The closest we get is MJ telling Harry to relax, and even that was because she was making fun of him. This is a weird feeling, man. And to top it off, we found out Harry is very good at listening and talking to MJ, adding more onto the idea that she'd rather confide in him than Peter. Oh man, this is some spice. I'm a little upset at the idea police aren't treated as nicely as a masked vigilante, but in this universe it makes sense at least. I can't imagine the cops from the first 2 movies hitting water if they fell out of a boat. Also, how exactly did they practice the speech without being able to contact Spider-Man? Gwen indicates the direction Spider-Man is swinging from when he calls his name out, almost if it was a cue for him to arrive from that direction. Like, huh? A simple fix for this would actually be a line of dialogue between Gwen and Peter as she exclaims her frustration of wanting to thank Spider-Man but not knowing how to reach him. Peter could retort by saying he knows how to contact Spider-Man simply due to the fact that he's his personal photographer, leading to Gwen relaying the information on where he needs to swing from. This scene would serve 2 purposes. The first being that it allows for this scene to make sense, but also to start developing their relationship further, which would have added to the drama of the third-party girlfriend. Love it or hate it, but added development is always a good thing. Considering dialogue like this would have been a reflection of what we saw in the first film, it would have communicated to the audience exactly what is going on here, without being so blatant about it. It would also have built up on the premise of Peter's arrogance growing since he seems to think the sun shines out of his arse the longer this film continues. And with would set up his fallout with MJ much better if this relationship with Gwen was something Harry could exploit. Just gonna keep on layering these reasons for why Sandman should have been removed. Why was the crowd's first reaction to Gwen and Spidey meeting for them to kiss? The fuck? And why does Peter accept? He knows MJ is watching. He knows she isn't doing well mentally. What the fuck are you doing, you unplugged vending machine? Perhaps he's just paying her back for using John as leverage against him? But since you're planning to repose this evening, this seems like a bloody awful time to start being vindictive. God, you two really did just switch cosmic allegiances this time around. This random kid has more logic than an entire parade of adults. After that embarrassing display of pixels, we have Sandman arriving on scene to spook some sense into people again as he moves towards the armored truck. Now you could question why he decided to fly in front of this parade instead of going around, especially since it calls forth the attention of Spider-Man. But considering that Flint has likely been in prison since Uncle Ben's death in the first film, I can't believe he hasn't heard of Spider-Man. Unless during those last 2 years he managed to fill up a significant percentage of the prisons. Even then, he probably imagines that Spider-Man would be incapable of harming him at this point, so it doesn't really matter. He lands himself on top of the truck and proceeds to punch a hole into said truck. So apparently a punch that was strong enough to break through an armored car did nothing to the officer who got hit on the inside.
Okay.
And apparently they aren't suffocating on all of the sand they just got sunk into.
Okay.
And it seems Peter learned a lesson from Andrew Garfield in TASM 2. Again. Apparently he would rather crack jokes instead of webbing the still moving armored truck so as to avoid any more unnecessary public damage and potential fatalities.
Okay.
Fun fact about this scene. That isn't Toby. During the production of this film, Thomas Hayden Church was often superimposed onto the screen where computer-generated imagery was then applied. One such scene is the one where Spider-Man punches a hole through his chest. Obviously. To get the effect they needed, Toby was replaced with an amputee martial arts expert named Baxter Humby, whose right hand was amputated at birth, allowing for the intended effect of punching Sandman through the chest to be properly delivered. The amount of time I spent trying to think of a joke that could accompany this fun fact honestly could have made a small video on its own, so I'll move on instead. Oh, did you just now realize that there were people in danger, you pickled fruit fly? Imagine what would have happened if you used that oh so handy super strength of yours to stop the car from moving. You know, the same strength you used to stop a speeding 8-car passenger train in the last film? Would make fighting Sandman a whole lot easier. Ah, whatever, it'll be fine. Oh yes, just undress on top of this building, semi in view of the people beneath you. It's not like someone would be attempting to follow you with a camera and try and snip some photos. Perhaps someone whose job it is to catch you with your hand in a cookie jar. No one comes to mind. And then what about the other 7,999,999 people who live in the city, some of which have cameras thanks to tourism? Well, I guess they can go fuck themselves too then. Spider-Man's gotta sniff his foot. It's not even the first time he's done it either. What is wrong with you, Parker? There are chili lemon flavored Lay's packets with less empty air than you have swimming around that mushroom patch you call a brain. Boo! The next scene has Peter arriving at a French restaurant in preparation for the dinner he planned to have with MJ. This leads to us being introduced to Bruce Campbell's latest cameo as he plays the role of a French receptionist, which is easily his funniest role in the trilogy. However, judging by Jake Gyllenhaal's performance, perhaps his role as Mysterio would have been funnier. No real way of knowing. Nevertheless, the scene has Peter making a request with the receptionist to deliver his wedding ring that he received from Aunt May in order to surprise MJ. So it is at this point in the film where I think most people have the biggest issue with Peter, and rightfully so. Ignoring the fact he kissed Gwen earlier this morning on the night he planned to repose, this scene also has him being completely ignorant of MJ's plight, that it borders narcissistic behavior. Despite clear facial cues from MJ telling him he needs to stop behaving like a self-obsessed crayon, along with the fact Peter's supposed to be celebrating her accomplishments and her success, he somehow manages to continue expositing about just how great his life is and how popular he has become. To round this off, we actually have Gwen arriving on scene to talk to Peter at possibly the absolute worst time. MJ had just finished walking home to get changed and on her way spotted a magazine with Spider-Man snogging Gwen upside down. A token so important to her that it is her chosen method of figuring out who the flying panther-punching fuck Spider-Man is. On top of this already upsetting set of circumstances, we have her needing to deal with the fact she is now unemployed from her dream job, which Peter is blissfully ignorant of, not really helping with her feeling of insecurity. Now, this isn't necessarily Peter's fault for not knowing, but considering that MJ has all of this stuff to deal with at once, I can completely understand her frustration in this situation. And since Peter hasn't been the best person to her today, the fact he is incapable of recognizing the need to quit while he is ahead makes him about as intelligent as microwaved Greek yogurt. We also have the inconsistent... You also have the inconsistent tone to deal with, as Bruce Campbell's lovable and well-meaning French receptionist tries to assist Peter in his attempt to propose. Every time Peter waves at Gwen, Bruce's character thinks it's a signal from Peter to bring the bottle of champagne with the ring at the bottom of the glass. These moments are meant to be played for laughs and are pretty funny, but considering how serious this conversation is, I don't think it works to deliver a consistent tone or mood the scene is going for. Instead, it becomes rather distracting. Perhaps this was just a subtle way for the director to communicate the disparities between the two characters. Peter's POV is humorous, bubbly, and generally fun as he enjoys having a gay old time reminiscing his day's events, which is reflected in how cheerful Bruce's character was during their first meeting. So naturally, everything from Peter's perspective would be cheerful and fun, such as the multiple false signals sent to the Frenchman. Alternatively, we have MJ, who is the opposite of those attributes given to Peter's POV. So naturally, everything from her perspective is going to come off as annoying or generally tone deaf. Conversely, I could just be talking out of my own ass, but that is for you to decide. Anyways, moving on. And where shall we move on to? Well, I'd actually like to discuss Peter's character in this segment, as well as a general summary of him throughout the film. And I'd like to start that discussion with a question. Is Peter inconsistently written in this scene? I've just explained why what Peter did is deficient, both in class and intelligence, but I never blatantly said if this was out of character for him. And that's because I don't actually know. Peter's ability to fail at correctly reading a situation is actually consistent with how he's depicted in the second film, but they aren't quite the same thing. In that film, he is trying desperately to salvage his relationship with MJ, and in an attempt to do so, cited poetry to try and win her back. He's very clearly uncomfortable and incapable of reacting intelligently, most likely due to all the stress he is under, even though he had more than enough info to provide a reasonable explanation for his disappearance, but I'm not going to mention that again. Here he isn't trying to salvage anything and is blissfully unaware of what situation he currently is in. So is he truly out of character for not being aware of what his circumstances are despite causing a large amount of it? Well, that seems to be an ongoing theme that this film tries to explore. Who is Peter Parker when everything goes his way? What happens to a hero who allows the power and fame to go to their head? Is it necessarily bad writing for a film to explore negative aspects of a character, or rather is the execution of how that aspect is explored? This film is rushed. It tries to explore too many avenues too quickly and is incapable of settling any of them with a sufficient amount of time. One of those aspects is Peter's character. I do not think what the film is trying to explore here is an example of bad writing, but rather rushed development due to the time constraints. Peter has already shown an aptitude for enjoying the spotlight and fame in his first outing as the wall crawler during his cage match, and is routinely upset at how the Daily Bugle presents him in their newspapers. So a depiction of him being enamored by his newly found fame and admiration doesn't seem out of the realm of plausibility, especially considering the only thing he has known for 2 years before this point was mild disdain from a large percentage of the city. But is this enamorment enough to distract you from the reality of your environment, especially when it is concerning your love life? Well, yes. According to www.psycholife.org, fame changes a person's life forever. Shocker, I know, but according to the same site, this change is felt as more of an impact or overnight sensation rather than a gradual transition. The individual in question goes through a developmental process of loving, then hating the fame, addiction, acceptance, then adaptation, positively or negatively as a result of the experience. It also speaks of the person developing a sort of character split between their usual self and the newly acquired celebrity self, as a means of combating or adapting to their new environment associated with celebrity life. The exact same thing MJ questions Peter on when he kisses Gwen. Who was it performing the act? Was it Peter Parker, a lovable dork from next door? Or was it this version of Spider-Man who has become a local celebrity basically overnight? Peter shirks this off and dismisses the notion that he was unfaithful or intentionally trying to hurt MJ by saying,
"She's just a girl in my class,"
implying that he wasn't completely conscious of what he was doing and just going through the motions. After all, it's not every day you are awarded the key to the city. Quite frankly, the idea that he would be oblivious to his own actions does seem to line up with the sort of person he is. Someone who doesn't try to find hidden meaning behind gestures and simply tries to explain things matter-of-factly. Because that's who he is, and thus creating the drama. MJ takes this kiss as a personal slight against her because the action has significant meaning to her, something which has been shown multiple times through these films. Peter has not had such a connection to that moment as she does, but rather a connection to her, which means he wouldn't see why this action was as much of a problem. He was essentially just acting, even if he was acting like an asshole. So no, I don't think he's out of character. I think what we are shown is an exploration of an individual developing a negative trait as a direct result of their environment, as well as how they line up with traits that we are already familiar with from other previously established moments in this series. The biggest issue was that it wasn't given enough time to properly develop. And as always, this is just my own thought experiment, and you do not not need to take any of what I say seriously if you don't want to. You may feel free to disagree with me in the comments or even drop a dislike if you so please. Nevertheless, I think I'm done with this segment. Moving on. Oh, but first, a mild bit of praise, but I really like how they whisper to each other in the entirety of this conversation. It reduces the risk of other people hearing you blabber about superhero business, so good job. Really digging how much MJ and Peter feel more like people in this installment. Peter tries to call MJ multiple times to clear up any issues they have, and MJ's on the brink of wanting to answer but can't bring herself to face the issues just yet, while not being portrayed as a giga cunt. Smell that? That's personality. Wish we got more of that these days. We now arrive at the scene of Police Captain Stacy explaining who Flint Marco is to Aunt May and Peter, retconning the events of the first film and introducing the revenge subplot for this film. Now, the reason why I'm not a particular big fan of this retcon is because I don't like how convenient it is that the single most powerful villain Spider-Man has ever faced also just so happens to be the person who accidentally killed his uncle. I acknowledge that luck and convenience do play parts in our everyday life, and that not every convenience should be seen as a flaw for simply existing, but this does do harm to that segment of the film. In my review of Spider-Man 1, I acknowledge this scene as one of the only ones in the film to not possess any noteworthy issues, due to the fact that it all seemed to work off cause and effect, with the scene providing notable tension and drama, leading to a satisfying climactic ending between Peter and the gunman. The scene also served the purpose of creating a morally grey area for Peter, as he was somewhat responsible for the death of the gunman, even if it was as a result of self-defense. This morally grey area was a perfect element of Peter's character to further develop and explore, especially since this film introduces the black suit. A perfect segue into analysing what a darker version of Peter is capable of doing, considering what he was already capable of. I also don't like how Peter was so incredibly willing to hunt this man down for murdering his uncle, when the last film had him forgiving himself for this inaction thanks to Aunt May, applauding him for his bravery. If a revenge subplot really needed to be done, then Harry feels like the clear go-to character for this subplot, considering how much of Peter's life he is still capable of affecting. This subplot feels like a regression of his character for no good reason instead of a reaction to his immediate surroundings, similar to how it was in the first film. One thing I will praise the scene for is taking into account why Peter and Aunt May were never told about Flint in the years since the incident. According to Captain Stacy, Flint confessed his crimes to his cellmate just before escaping, which lined up with a handful of eyewitness reports. Stacy is only working with new information, so it makes sense why he's choosing to tell them now. They arrested Marco for being an asset in robbery as well as murder, but if they had no evidence to support him being responsible for the action, then I can buy them not telling the Parkers. Just another scene of MJ being a reasonable person trying to talk to Peter. However, due to his building anger at finding out who was responsible for his uncle's death, he decides to ignore her aid and blow her off. Makes sense considering the situation, and is in line with the more arrogant Peter we have been seeing develop. Nothing more to say. I also like how this scene is evidence for my earlier points of him not needing to go out on patrol as frequently if the police sirens don't pick up any disturbances. Means he'd likely have more free time dedicated to doing his homework, study, or even take MJ out on dates. That last one is a bit of a risk, but hey, the homie's gotta live a normal life too, so don't worry about it. The city's safe and his uncle would be proud. The presentation of the symbiote in the scene also establishes some of its characteristics, which are going to be semi-properly explained in later segments of the film. It appears to be attracted towards Peter's anger and frustration as he dreams of Uncle Ben being killed by Flint Marco. This explains somewhat why the symbiote didn't try to bind with him any other night, as it finds these attributes of Peter to be rather appealing. The shadow of the symbiote also seems to form some sort of smiling demon, expressing the idea that Peter in this state is alluring, thus causing it to tether to him, forming the now iconic Raimi black suit. And now it's time to talk design. I simply adore the way this suit looks. The film could have gone the easy way out and just designed a suit which lacks any detail except for the spider on his chest, similar to the way he looks in the comics and the cartoon. However, even though that design would have been considered adequate by a lot of people, especially considering the appeal to accuracy, I am extremely happy we got this design instead. It is the regular Raimi suit, but, well, black. And it looks fucking awesome! This would also mean that the suit would share the same web motif as the regular red and blue suit, which was meant to do two things. The motif was meant to bestow the symbiote a sense of life, giving it the appearance of gripping onto the body, adding to the idea that it's binding with its host, instead of simply being just another piece of clothing. You can tell the difference between how the motif is depicted on each costume by noticing how much they stand out compared to each other. The red and blues motif is much thicker with a dark silver greyish colour to allow it the ability of being more detached from the red and blue, where with the black suit it's a much lighter shade of silver, which allows for the motif to be noticeable but also to blend in much more with the suit. It is also not nearly as thick, as it appears to be an actual pattern woven into the suit rather than just metal gratings super glued on. As I said, details, man, they are important. However, this then resulted in the suit worn by Topher Grace being a reflection of this design, sporting its own web motif similar to the black suit. This was the other thing. According to producer Grant Curtis, it's the Spider-Man suit but twisted and mangled in its own right. Venom's design, while not being accurate to the comics, possessed the motif as a means of demonstrating the symbiote's control and represents the character as a twisted foil to Spider-Man, at least according to the wiki. This was also something Raimi apparently wanted, stating he felt the symbiote should be given a sense of character, rather than just being reflective of a spider or octopus, leading to the graphics designers creating multiple separate strands of the symbiote for the CGI model.
Julian!
Apparently, while animating Venom himself, the animators took inspiration from big cats, such as lions and cheetahs, for his agile movements, supporting the sense of the suit being a vicious predator. Again, going back to its first depiction before binding to Peter. The suit also does this weird thing for me since it makes Toby appear larger in stature, aiding to the idea that it's making him stronger, which we can tell based on how much bigger his back and chest are compared to the regular suit. He is far more imposing in this suit, which is just chef's kiss. Accompanying the suit reveal, we also have the black suit theme, which is just, it's so good. The theme feels heroic, but with a dark undertone. It's unhinged without seeming villainous, giving the sense of a hero who's unmatched in strength, as well as not being completely sound morally. Perfectly apt description for the act Peter is about to perform. That's enough gushing. Moving on. Peter goes to Doc Connors to have him inspect a sample of the symbiote in order to figure out what it is. Doc can't seem to do that and says he requires more tests in the morning, but gives Peter a basic understanding of what the symbiote is, warning him not to let any of it onto him. This is probably the only setup in the film for the symbiote becoming harder and harder to get rid of, as there's no other line of dialogue or scene which shows Peter struggling to get the suit off. Would have liked to see if they were though. Every scene before the bell tower scene in the church depicts the suit as, well, a suit, and it's pretty easy to remove. The only sort of inclination we get that Peter struggles to take the suit off is because of how powerful he feels when he wears it, much to Doc's disappointment. A more literal representation of the suit being difficult to remove would have gone a long way to assist with the feeling that it is a sentient entity instead of a hot topic collection. Having it cling more and more onto Peter's skin would establish the suit as entirely dependent on Peter as its host, fitting in with what Doc says here along with his second scene explaining the suit. But let us proceed. A little bit convenient that the police radio tells Peter about a sandstorm robbing a bank literally as he enters the room instead of playing when he's in his room, possibly reflecting on what Doc Connors told him, ultimately ignoring his warning, as he puts on the suit to track down Flint, but whatever. As Peter arrives at the scene of the crime, he notices two things. The bank appears to be undergoing some reconstruction with the guards lying unconscious on the ground, as well as noticing a chain of sand flowing into the subway train tunnels via this grating. Oddly convenient that there is a sliver of sand left to follow into said tunnels instead of a cold trail, but considering that police were alerted of a crime in progress and Peter heard the distress call upon entering his apartment, I'm fine with him making it here just in the nick of time. What I'm confused on is how Sandman transported the bags of money down here, since the only entrance he used was the grating above ground, of which Spider-Man ripped out of said ground before tossing aside as he chased after Sandman. Meaning that either Sandman lifted this grate up in order to get the money bags down here and just so happens to have the ability to create concrete with his sand, putting the grating back in its place, or this movie just forgot that detail. Not even a nitpick either, because Spider-Man lifting said grating is what allows Eddy Brock to get to him in time to scoop some Spidey pics for the Bugle, leading to his camera being busted as a result of Peter not liking him. This minor act is then what leads Eddie to framing Spider-Man for the robbery of the bank, culminating in a confrontation between Eddie and Peter inside of the Bugle. This confrontation has a butterfly effect which causes Eddie to, in order of events, lose his job, become a cuckold, seek religion, become a hentai protagonist, watch that one scene from Attack of the Clones, and explode. So yeah, we need a fucking explanation for how Sandman can make concrete, damn it. Fun fact, while promoting the film on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, Thomas Hayden Church mentioned that during the filming of the subway scene, he managed to break 3 knuckles as a result of punching the brick wall. According to Church, the effects crew had told him the middle brick layer was fake while the upper and lower layers were real. However, during the filming of the scene, the foam layer had yet to be put in place. So when Raimi said action, he spun around and hit the actual brick on the first take. Talk about contrived writing, am I right? Anywho. As the fight proceeds, we see that Spider-Man's attacks hurt Flint. Somehow. Okay, so when his DNA was altered to replace every fiber of his being with that stuff cat shit in, did that not include his pain receptors? I mean, Jesus, when Spider-Man first met him, he punched a hole right through him and it didn't even faze Marco. He acted as if it was just a poke in the gut with a paper airplane, seeming mildly annoyed more than anything. Here, similar attacks not only hurt him, but don't go straight through his body. Am I supposed to believe that a Spider-Man who's powered up by his own anger and frustration, along with whatever power boost comes from wearing the black suit, doesn't hit as hard as a Spider-Man who had most of the blood in his body swarming to his
penis?
Is the power of bonus truly so strong that it has to force the opposition to create their own plot armor in order to survive? Because I have a feeling that if Peter hit a hole through Marco right now, he would be screaming in pain. This takes the inconsistent durability from the two films and just farts in their general direction. Bloody hell, I thought the chair would never be topped. And it still hasn't, baby! Actually, Sandman's entire ability set seems rather nerfed in this fight. He isn't forming weapons such as hammers anymore, he isn't shifting into his sandcloud form, and he only uses his extension ability once in the fight, despite being a really good utility that grants him an advantage of reach, making him significantly more dangerous. I also don't think the excuse of he's inexperienced can be used to handwave these arguments away, since we have already seen him use each of these abilities before this fight, while containing the same amount of sand in his body. So what is the excuse this time? I'd like to think the reason for why Sandman was nerfed so drastically was as a result of needing to show how powerful Peter is in the black suit. By putting him up against an enemy that defeated him the last time in his classic red and blue, only to be dominated in the rematch while wearing the symbiote suit. However, with that said, I would like to point out that Peter isn't exactly the smartest biscuit in this jar either, relying on, well, quite frankly, extreme contrivance in order to secure his victory. He knows physical attacks do not work on his opponent, meaning his decision to engage in open combat feels extremely ill-advised. He takes several liberties in the fight to goad Marco, one of which results in him being hit by 2 trains as a result, and he quite frankly had no end goal in sight when beginning the rumble. Think about it. How is Peter going to defeat, let alone kill Marco, who for all intents and purposes is an indestructible entity? The entire fight from Peter's perspective relied on blind, simple, clueless luck. His physical attacks work now when they shouldn't, Marco isn't taking full advantage of his abilities when he has no reason not to, and he was extremely fortunate to find out that Sandman was weak to water just as he landed on a water barrel? Yeah, sure, let's go with that. In comparison to the new Goblin fight from the start of the film, as well as a few of the engagements from the previous films, this is just really shit. Unlike Doc Ock, who only had 2 tentacle blades capable of ending the fight immediately, Sandman falls in line with someone like Green Goblin, who is just a walking tentacle blade due to their weaponry and abilities on hand respectively. His refusal to use his more lethal methods of stopping Spider-Man, such as drowning him in sand, pinning him down to be run by a train, or just being aggressive and using his hammers more frequently, makes his role in this fight about as engaging as Whiskey Dick after a night on the town. He's gone from being an interesting and intimidating opponent to just a walking, talking, literal punching bag. If there was some sort of explanation for why Peter was capable of successfully landing attacks, then maybe this fight wouldn't be so bad. For example, we could find out that the substance the symbiote is made from shares the same properties as water, which is why his attacks weaken Sandman. You know, something like that. We could even have had a One Piece fight where Peter just drenched his hands in water in order to beat some sense into Marco's candy ass. Bad fight, 3 out of 10. Not to mention that I'm pretty sure Spider-Man fucked up a pretty big part of the city's water system with this little maneuver. I have no idea what this barrel/pump is connected to or what purpose it serves, but it's likely going to be important since why would it be there if it wasn't? Oh, and I don't have a problem with irresponsible Peter doing this, as Edgy the Spidey has always been depicted as morally reprehensible whenever wearing the suit. My issue lies more with the fact that nobody in the film calls him out for this action. Not even JJ, which is a borderline character assassination. The fuck? Anyways, moving on. I like how after all that nonsense, the mere act of Peter changing his hairstyle in the mirror to look like a shonen rival to the main protagonist is what snaps him out of his daze. My man literally gazed at his cut and thought it looked yee in the mirror. Fucking bamfing. Now when it comes to Bully Maguire, I think Toby does well acting with his face and his eyes in order to properly express what emotion he wants to show in the scene. But unfortunately, I find his delivery of lines to come off as unintentionally comedic, which is likely what led to those scenes in particular being memed on so hard.
Give me rent.
You'll get your rent when you fix this damn door!
They are incredibly goofy, which, while funny, doesn't do a good job for the tone when you want to demonstrate a more serious scene, such as him telling the rent lord to fuck off. And it's not like Toby lacks the ability to sound convincing, he seems to pull it off well enough in films such as Brothers 2009 for instance. So perhaps the direction here is what's taking away from the impact of the delivery? I don't know, and I'm trying to view this film as objectively as I can while ignoring outside meme material, so I don't think it's me contributing my dislike in his performance here to an already existing bias for the memes, but then again it may be subconscious, so take that with a grain of salt. Moving on. I find Aunt May's dialogue in this scene to be especially poignant due to how it's clearly directed towards Peter while making Spider-Man the subject of the conversation. I've been under the impression Aunt May knew Spider-Man was Peter since the second film during her conversation with him at the yard cleanup, so the added level of subtext is appreciated. You can glean a sense of disappointment from her dialogue while also trying to be a guiding voice in Peter's hour of darkness. She doesn't want to be too grudging or overbearing by criticizing him for his actions, but rather make him feel ashamed for them by bringing up how Uncle Ben would have felt had he known. She tries to help him steer towards a lighter path without going through the effort of creating a meaningless decision tree for the viewer to select. This continues to remain consistent with her established character and definitely aids Peter in reconsidering his actions. It's a shame though that this is never something he ponders on after this scene. Perhaps if there was a moment where he has this conversation playing in his head but her voice becomes more and more muffled, indicating that the suit is trying to trick his mind into believing that the interaction never happened or that it wasn't even important nor helpful. So many interesting angles to approach the suit with, and we get none of them. When even one of the lead producers thinks your film needs to be bisected, then you know you have an issue with conveying enough information to the audience in a believable manner. I also find it odd that MJ's first instinct after being fired from Broadway was to apply for a position as a waitress who sings. Did she not even try and apply for a different Broadway position? Perhaps a casting call for a competent actress? Does she not have an agent or any form of contact in the business to help her out? What about her friend from the last film? Couldn't she give her a call? The film wants to create this drama of her looking for less fulfilling work, but doesn't give us even an indication she tried to continue her pursuit of happiness inside a business she should already be familiar with for at least a year. Considering the timeline of this film, perhaps John is the reason for her being sacked out of the industry, being as influential as he is as the son of the former largest newspaper in the city? Just a smidge of interesting character drama would have been enough for me, like giving cheese to a starving rat only to smack it with a newspaper that is the rest of this film. Don't really have anything to say about her choice to contact Harry over Peter. It's already been established that Harry does a better job at making MJ feel better through their interactions, so I can buy this. Great Dickovich and Ursula scenes, by the way. They both remain excellent additions to these films, and they never fail to crack a smile on my face. I will also keep in mind to use Dickovich's pickup lines. The man clearly knows what he is talking about by virtue of having a daughter, who's a lovely lady in her own right, so the man undoubtedly scored in that department. Bless you, Rent Lord. I will say that the passionate relationship between MJ and Harry is a little fast. Sure, Harry makes MJ feel better about herself, is charismatic and fun to hang around, as well as already possessing a romantic history with her that he may or may not remember, but considering the fact that they have only shared 2 scenes together, barely 3, there seems to not be enough solid foundation for me to reliably believe this relationship blooming and progressing as far as it did. If they wanted to go this far, then perhaps implying an element of intoxication would have been helpful to alleviate some sound mental judgment on at least MJ's behalf. As is, I don't see her cheating on Peter even if he did kiss Gwen. Then again, in Spider-Man 2... No! Stop it, Shandy. Bad squirrel. You promised not to do this shit again. I'm sorry, other Shandy. I was weak. I couldn't see a reasonable explanation for her thottery. It needed course correction. Forgive me. If you promise not to do it again, then we can avoid sending you into the furnace along with the rest of the bad nuts. Okay, deal. I'll make sure to avoid this in future. Good. Right. So in Spider-Man 2... After falling for the advances of the female, the weakened Alpha seeks guidance from the ghost of the dead Sigma, who scrutinizes him for forgetting his way, encouraging and reminding Harry of the purpose of getting on the grind in the first place, achieving the kill Spider-Man to avenge my father and near gobset and reaching his true potential. As for his memory deciding to return now, sure, it may seem convenient or inconvenient depending on your perspective, but considering that memory is a fickle thing, with amnesia having varieties of severity depending on the cause, we need to examine what it was that caused it to come back at this point. We can agree that the cause of his short-term amnesia was the concussion he received while fighting Peter, and as stated before, concussions tend to disrupt the electrical activity of the brain, which prevents the short-term memory from working properly. So we have the cause down, but what about the treatment? Well, again, it is complicated. Concussions require rest to recover from once all other factors have been ruled out. But Harry's memory seems to come back as a result of having an intimate moment with MJ, implying that love and affection is what caused him to recover, meaning that according to the same site, Harry also suffered memory loss due to a traumatic event. Now in saying that, I do acknowledge that correlation doesn't equal causation, meaning that just because MJ kissed him doesn't then mean that it is the reason for his memory coming back. Perhaps it simply came back because it was time to come back, which we know from a script standpoint point is true, but I'm not trying to be too meta about it. We also have the added benefit of MJ commenting on his injury healing so quickly, seeming surprised at the lack of even a scar, granting the audience the ability to pick up on a visual reason for his recovery. Nevertheless, exposure to a strong enough impulse could help trigger a primal memory he has stored. And his only connection with MJ that is negative enough to affect him like this is his father, if you remember how he treated Harry's relationship with MJ in the first film. This exposure seems to have a spiraling effect, unlocking more and more stored memories until eventually he has mostly restored his subconscious as well as his purpose. We still see his recollection of events playing tricks with his psyche as he recounts images and scenarios out of order in his mind, referring specifically to his recollection of the conversation with Peter in the hospital, which has the negative consequence of associating memories of Peter with the gleeful murder of his father, something he dreads remembering. Now all of this was acquired using inference based on what is displayed on screen as well as my own general knowledge and research into the topic, so feel free to disagree with the assessment in the comments if you so please. Moving on. I am willing to believe that Harry was capable of sneaking up on MJ for two main reasons. The first being that he's wearing an all-black attire, making it easier to blend into the darkness of nighttime New York. The second being that the board has already been established as a quiet means of transportation, unlike the previous glider, meaning he can hover in place either in her room or just outside the apartment window. Even when he grabs MJ, the board refuses to make noise, so props for thinking about this in hindsight. I just don't know if this is actually possible. Comic booky science is booky. Whatever. Moving on. More evidence that Ursula is the best waifu of the bunch. She is the only being to open this door without super strength, and didn't even complain when Peter refused to offer assistance. The fucker was being rude, but she didn't even mind. What an actual blessing she is. And she did all of that just to give Peter some good news.
You were too good for this world.
Now I am fine with MJ refusing to tell Peter what is happening here on the bridge out of fear for his life. We never get told how Harry plans to kill Peter, or if he can distinguish the difference between MJ telling Peter what he wants and the truth, but we can infer that he has a plan to deal with this. Harry is located very near to the bridge and has clear lines of sight of the couple, so we can glean that he's capable of telling the difference between genuine heartbreak and secretive plotting against him. Something MJ would likely have been warned of before she spoke to Peter, and since she is clearly scared for both Peter's life and hers, she doesn't want to risk either of them dying because she spilled her beans. As for method of murder, well, take your pick. Explosive pumpkin bombs, showers of bladed bats, a flamethrower, planted explosives on the bridge or even in their homes, a fucking sword, or even missiles. Harry could duly have given MJ a remote-controlled explosive device capable of eviscerating them both where they stand. So yeah, I get not telling Peter. The issue comes in after Peter beats up Harry and refuses to go and clear things up with MJ. We could have seen a plethora of events taking place after this fight at the Osborn mansion. The symbiote being a possessive alien entity could likely have convinced Peter that MJ was his and that he shouldn't even let her leave his side. This aggressive approach from Peter under the symbiote's influence could have scared MJ and possibly led to her breaking up with him for real, which would have been some interesting drama, leading to him dating Gwen out of petty revenge. Bro, we needed this movie to be split up. Bloody hell. Although now I need to question Harry's plan. What was your end goal? If you were planning on pissing Peter off, then why did you approach him in such a sly and careful manner? You make an attempt to cause friction in MJ and Peter's relationship, using yourself as the magical third party, so that I understand. But then you immediately put doubts upon said friction by indicating to Peter that something is amiss with the situation. Then using the Speed Force, you teleport out of sight after giving Peter this extremely obvious troll face, like, huh? What are you doing, you dusty eraser? And now that you have Peter annoyed, you have the perfect opportunity to set up an ambush for when he arrives to confront you, which you just don't do. For fuck's sake. You could have had an entire Kraven the Hunter style booby trap in your apartment while still fighting in hand-to-hand combat if that's what you really wanted from the start. Then again, if you were to go the route of subtlety, then why didn't you try and expose Peter's identity using peekaboo tactics? Attempt to threaten him with exposure by sending him ambiguous letters while feigning ignorance. This could have created a real sense of dread in Peter as he desperately tries to hide his secret, possibly even going as far as confronting MJ, who at this point is the only person he is aware of that knows his secret. Imagine a mentally unstable Peter driven to madness by the suits and harming his own heart. That would have accomplished so much for Harry that he wouldn't even need to do any more work. Peter could also have gotten himself fired for going off on Eddy, who would have been a suspect, considering his attempts to win JJ's favor. So many interesting avenues to take this conflict in had you just stuck to one method of antagonization rather than double dipping. And Odyssey makes Harry seem like a complete moron, and I'm genuinely sick of idiotic antagonists in this franchise, so moving on. I will say I do like how Peter makes the conscious decision to beat Harry's ass in his regular clothing rather than in his full Spider-Man getup. Gives off a sense of a personal vendetta being acted upon rather than just him beating up another villain. Or perhaps it was because he didn't want to be caught on camera by accident beating up one of New York's finest bachelors. Either way, the fight is also marginally better than the Sandman fight, but still weaker than the opening conflict. Harry's first planned attack is to stab Peter, which doesn't go very well for him as Peter manages to prevent the knife going too deep. He also manages to use his arm blade very early in the fight, so I can't make the excuse of, oh, he had a tentacle blade, at least with this device. Unfortunately, Harry still has access to a variety of different gadgets and utilities that would aid him in confronting Parker. The obvious one that stands out to me is still the gun he has been shown owning in the first film. Whatever happened to this little thing? It just eviscerated itself from the Raimi universe. Then you have to consider that Harry still has a sword, hoverboard, bombs, more knives, and potentially other weapons he can fashion from his environment, such as a broken glass or a wooden spear made from a chair leg. Get creative! It's an average fight to say the most since there are some good elements put in place, but it is predominantly rather disappointing as an engagement. Would have liked to see Harry being more prepared and putting up more of a fight. I also need to comment on the music for this scene, which just feels odd, and I don't know why. It sounds like aggressive jazz, which is just a baffling creative decision. Paired it up with the goofy delivery of some lines, and you've taken this supposed tense and intimate moment between two former best friends colliding and turned it into an Archer skit.
Good job.
You gonna kill me like you killed my father?
I'm done trying to convince you.
Bruh, how you gonna talk behind my back when you dead ass built like a...
Peter, you didn't try convincing him of shit. Shut up. Well, I guess we can firmly say Harry does, in fact, not know about spider sense. Unless this was just a desperate last-ditch effort to kill Peter, but then why throw the grenade at him and not the floor next to him if you did know? Ugh, this is confusing. Also, that grenade likely blew up every other grenade lying down on the floor, creating a chain reaction of explosions which would blow up the entire room. Harry is such a fucked man. He should be dead. As we see Peter confronting Eddie about his rubbish attempts at trying to frame Spider-Man, I happen to notice more clearly an interesting detail about Peter's suit. Now, full credit where credit is due, this is something I read on the IMDb page, but it's something that I noticed more clearly upon observing the scene. Whenever Spider-Man removes his mask, the collar on his suit is usually located much higher up on the neck, for both the red and black versions. We can see this especially with his fight against Harry. However, in this scene where he approaches Eddie, the collar is nowhere in sight, likely as a result of Peter trying to tie up his top buttons in order to hide the suit. Bit nitpicky, but now I can never not see it when watching this film again. Although, in saying that, I do need to ask Eddie a question. Did you honestly think that nobody would have noticed this picture was fake, let alone the person who took it in the first place? Now, I can see Eddie perhaps going through with this plan if Peter got himself fired for accusing Eddie of sending him false threats, such as I mentioned a little earlier ago. But when your prime opposition still works in the same building as yourself, then it seems like an incredibly risky ploy. If we'd maybe seen some inner conflict with him before this scene to help understand how he came to this conclusion, it would have been less idiotic. Perhaps he delusioned himself into thinking this was a great plan, creating some setup for his psyche breaking more after coming into contact with the symbiote, but as is, we literally have nothing to go on, which creates an issue. Now, it isn't as big as something like, oh, let's say, designing a second nuclear bomb without explaining why he would increase the amount of fuel used for the experiment, but it's still pretty dumb. Oh well, Bamfin Peter is Bamfin, let's continue. I don't really have anything to say about this montage besides, I like it and I think it's fun. It's the perfect level of goof, and I wish I saw more of this side of Peter in the film. But I would like to share some more insight from the cast as to what the decision making was for having this segment of the film be a montage.
I'm gonna put some dirt in your eye. That was Sam's idea, the like kind of, that kind of, right?
That was actually Ivan's line.
Oh, that was Ivan's line?
Yeah.
But the concept of like bringing some jazz to his character and that kind of old school speak, that was you and Ivan?
Yeah.
That was great.
Thanks.
Dude, this is my favorite part of this movie is you doing this cookies thing, man. I just think this is so hilarious, the way you talk down to her. It's like, the first time I saw it, I just cracked up. I couldn't care less about what this guy's saying.
It was a lot of fun, but it really is a solution to a problem we had, which is we had to have this scene with Doc Connors giving Peter this information, but we didn't think Peter would care so much about what Doc Connors had to say. And it was supposed to be like a scene, you know, where Peter's listening to Doc Connors. So this was our solution, I mean, to that problem.
I love that she loves it. That's the best part.
It's really good. It probably came from a question you had about would the character really do that? You know, would we really be interested in this even? And then the scene became about, well, where would the character be? He couldn't give a crap.
But this was something that you kind of put in late in the game, right, Sam? The whole montage was up in the air for a while with the walking down the street and the cookie scene and all this stuff, wasn't it?
Yes. There were a lot of things that we had to do and wanted to communicate. And then Ivan and I one day in the writing department combined them into a montage. We were thinking about the second picture also at that point, thinking, oh, this will be an interesting counterpoint to the whipped lame place he'd been to in the second picture.
Was singing in the rain and all that stuff. Yeah, exactly.
I always thought of Toby in these scenes as like an angry, dorky rock star because he has this eyeliner on, his hair is all shagged out, and he's like very 70s about it and doing weird dance moves. And there's not much to say after that move.
I like that you went up there and did that.
Yeah.
It's really entertaining.
There's a geek flair to it, but you actually have some good moves.
Well, thank you, sir. The geek flair was not an accident.
Oh my God.
Had to add that. That was the toughest part of the whole thing. Sam actually kept saying, you gotta bring the cool down.
I remember that part.
Oh, you don't remember that, Sam? I love how you can never quite tell how the ladies are reacting to Peter. Like, are they repulsed? Are they turned on? Or a little bit of both? I mean,
I think it's like real life, a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, back in the lowlands.
And again, you managed to keep a hold of this necklace despite literally liquidating into sludge as you got carried away through a drain. Look at how you got dispatched, my dude. How did you keep this thing? Fucking what? Well, goodbye. I guess I won't be seeing you again till the finale. So either Eddy was super unlucky to be on the exact same street as Peter and Gwen in order to see this interaction, or he was likely following them. Possibly tried wanting to hang out with Gwen, but then was stopped when he saw her with Peter. I can buy Eddy wanting to follow them in order to get an understanding of what their relationship is. Not to mention he is reasonably extremely bummed out at the prospect of being unemployed, so what else is he going to do with his free time? No real issue here. Those are some mystical fucking piano skills, my man. Where did you find the time to learn this? It's never even been hinted that you knew how to play an instrument, so like how the shit? I don't care. It's hype as fuck.
Let's go!
This scene is also completely batshit insane. It's like it comes from a completely different franchise. Peter's gush of wind when he takes off his jacket is giving me some serious Bollywood vibes. And I love it. It's fucking amazing. I cannot complain about this. It is just far too silly to take seriously, and quite frankly I wish there was more of it. Just this completely self-aware nonsense. It would have been great. Although Peter should likely have killed MJ with the smack, or at the very least, heavily injured her. Oh well. Also, surely someone saw his Spider-Man collar, right? His shirt was unbuttoned for a good few seconds while he was recovering from the shock of smacking MJ. Of all the people in this room, not one person noticed the web motif? A piece of iconography so recognizable by this point that it is literally used to market New York as a city for tourists. Fuck me, man. Not to mention Peter strong-armed several men at once, including a guy much bigger than himself with essentially zero difficulty. Can't any of the witnesses present potentially try and put two and two together? Okay. That's a really cool shot. I like it. However, now we come to the second largest contrivance in the film, the Eddy prayer scene. Now, most of us know that it is extremely lucky of Eddy to be arriving at this church at the exact same time as Peter deciding to disrobe his demons, but how lucky is it exactly? Well, according to catholicmanhattan.blogspot.com, a blog which encompasses a 2.5-year journey to attend Mass at every single Catholic church in Manhattan, the blogger in question made it his mission to attend Mass at each of the 96 different Catholic churches in Manhattan. Google Maps also cites this blog as a means of documenting every Catholic church in New York. So out of 96 different churches located all throughout Manhattan, Eddy Brock, who did not self-identify himself as a God-fearing man, decided to take up religion in order to acquire forgiveness on the exact same night Peter wanted to yeet the symbiote in the exact same church on the exact same fucking minute of the day. That is a 1.04% chance of happening in the same church, let alone the exact same fucking time of day. Holy hell. Probably still better odds than making the pizza delivery in the second film though. So now for some reason, the suit is physically attaching itself to Peter's skin, refusing to be removed when it has never shown signs of doing this before. Again, going back to my earlier point of needing to show the suit progressively getting more and more possessive of Peter. As is, this seems like a completely unnecessary set of drama for the sake of creating a new villain. Speaking of unnecessary, why did Peter feel the need to come here in the first place? If he had experiences with loud sounds before and knew this was an effective method of loosening the symbiote, then I'd believe him coming here, since it would have been reliant on cause and effect. However, as is, it doesn't make sense. Again, relying on luck that he figures this out at this specific moment. Actually, now it just makes me wonder why the sound of underground railroad trains didn't have this exact same effect on the suit. He was standing right next to two of them at the same time. He got smacked into one of them. Whatever. As Peter finally manages to get the last remnants of the suit off of his now naked body, Eddy becomes the new host of the symbiote just beneath Peter, while screaming the entire time. And Peter doesn't even hear his cries despite the fact the bell has stopped ringing. Now, I am willing to give some good faith here and simply say he couldn't have heard him because he is currently suffering from a mild case of tinnitus, with a rough ringing sound being heard in his ear. But I do not accept the fact that Peter just left the symbiote like that without bothering to recover it and perhaps giving it to Dr. Connors to study further. He literally just deployed the finna head out strategy and ignored the suit. What would happen if this came into contact with another person or even a dog? Did you maybe consider the fact that you survived contact with the suit because you are superhuman? This is so incredibly and unbelievably irresponsible of you that I'm wondering if you're going to start making appearances in the MCU. Oh fuck! We have some rather on-the-nose symbolism as we see Peter literally baptizing himself of his sins after expelling his demons in a church. All I need now is an anagram of limbo appearing above his head and the religious iconography trinity shall be complete. Or maybe he's just taking a shower to collect his thoughts and I'm being a spanner again. Julio, this fucking doorman. Holy shit. Aunt May's scene is, say it with me now folks, really good. Yes, that's right. It's not an overly complicated scene, but it does a good job at showing Peter demonstrating some honest self-reflection upon his actions, as well as having the classic encouragement from everyone's favorite cinematic aunt. I think. I don't really remember many others. There's Aunt May, the aunt from Big Hero 6, and Mrs. Dudley from Harry Potter. Can't say anything negative about the scene though, and not much positive to think about either. It's just an effective, well put together string of sentences attached to Meet Titans. Proceed. Is it a coincidence that Venom ran into Marco? No, not really, as Eddy said he was looking for him, and we can assume a few hours to even potentially a full day has passed since Peter deleted the symbiote. Now how about Eddy knowing who Sandman is? Knowing he is alive, knowing about his daughter, and knowing about him wanting to kill Spider-Man? Well, we never get a visual confirmation of this being the case, but I've always been under the impression that the symbiote is capable of transferring memories, or even creating events in their host's head. The reason for this is because of how Peter suffers from a nightmare just as the symbiote is closing in around him. It seems to sense his anger and frustration and is somehow capable of increasing the effectiveness of these feelings by emphasizing the dream. Reason why I say this is because, well, before the symbiote touches him, Peter seems to be having a pretty standard sleeping experience, which then changes to audible nightmare noises along with physical reactions as the symbiote spreads, clearly indicating to the audience that it is having an effect on his dreams and mental state, possibly even creating them in the first place. Then as we examine Eddy, we have to come to a rather short conclusion. He had no means of doing a background check on Marco before finding him, he lacks the resources necessary to do this, and would have no reason to begin the search in the first place. This is because, other than Spider-Man, no one else knows that Marco is the Sandman. You could argue that the police officers who attacked him, but none of the police in this film make that clear for the audience. Even if they did know, I highly doubt this is information that Eddy would have access to, or even if he would think to go there in the first place. So we are left with one option of how Eddy knew this information, which is that the symbiote managed to inform him about the situation, possibly transferring memories or even creating them for Eddy to experience. The suit is its own self-aware entity, so I don't see why it would be incapable of informing or communicating with Eddy in some manner. I just wish it was shown, to be honest. I'm not a particularly big fan of writing stories for the writer because the information was lacking, but I think this is a fair inference to make. Nevertheless, this does not then mean that Eddy should be aware of Marco's daughter, since that was never a piece of information that was made clear compared to Peter, meaning this is the one and only piece of intelligence Eddy had to do his own homework for, which just seems rather unlikely to me. Unless he managed to read about it in a newspaper, though that is something which still needs to be shown. Whatever, time to move on. Of course MJ looks in the direction of Peter just after he leaves, why wouldn't she? Is it contrived that this taxi just so happened to be the one with Eddy in it? Well, maybe. Considering that Venom is capable of mimicking the powers of Spider-Man, this would naturally make him as fast as he is, which according to the previous film means he is faster than a speeding car and a train going at least 50 miles per hour. So it is feasible for him to keep an eye out for MJ in her apartment and just get into a cab as she gets ready to leave. Unfortunately, this does rely on a bit of luck on his part that another car doesn't drive in front of him and that MJ even needs a cab in the first place. But it seems reasonable that he try at least. Plus, I think my stance on luck has been made fairly clear by this point over the course of these videos, but if not, then I shall reiterate. I am not as easily fed up by luck as a factor in film. I view it as an almost essential element of life that many of us are inclined to ignore. This tends to be viewed as lazy writing, with many people preferring it if their works of fiction relied almost exclusively on cause and effect. And I understand that viewpoint, I just don't agree with it. Because coincidence happens all the time in the real world, and I see no reason why we should exclude coincidence in film. There are multiple examples of coincidence being used in multiple films that are widely praised as excellent examples of media, especially for their writing. Depending on context, coincidence can go a long way into making a film feel believable and grounded, as we see people reacting in a believable fashion to this change in fortune. It also depends on execution, as all aspects of filmmaking do. I would also argue that it depends entirely on the viewer and their own suspension of disbelief. Some people are okay with lightning striking twice, and others find it inconceivable. Some find surviving headshots to be entirely too unlikely, and others tend to ignore it. There are arguments that can be made for each of these instances and how likely they are. Does this not make coincidence an inherent flaw or problem in a film, especially when it is done to serve a purpose? And yes, this was just a long way for me to say I'm okay with Eddy making this cab ride work. I just don't buy that people on the side of the street didn't see this kidnapping. However, since the next scene immediately starts with a public display, I don't think this is an issue. Moving on. Yeah, Peter, this is what happens when you just fucking ignore an alien life form at the bottom of a fucking church, you dip. Ah, what an amazing score. I can't even explain in words why it's so good. It just evokes such an emotion of hype and hope building up like a hero rising out of the ashes. However, it also has such a somber note to it, which isn't necessarily peaceful, but rather something evocative of self-acceptance maybe? Like Peter realizing that he made a mistake, but he's going to try and rectify it, even if it leads to his death. I don't know, but it's nice and I like it. Moving on. Damn, Harry, that wound of yours seems pretty well healed for someone who took a grenade to the face. Then again, MJ did comment on his head injury healing super fast, so perhaps it's a bonus of the serum that allows him super healing. Not unbelievable, just would like more references to this being a thing, like maybe a paper cut that closes quickly or something like that. Besides that, I find it funny that burn victim makeup looks better in 2007 than it does in 2021. God, this movie was ass.
My father, he go toilet on my hands.
Oh my god.
Peter tries appealing to Harry's sense of mutual love of MJ in order to get him to help Peter to save her, with Harry responding by saying,
"You don't deserve my help."
As if Peter is the only person at fault here, but whatever, he's still grumpy, his face looks like melted candle wax, so it's fine. After Peter leaves, Harry decides to explore the Goblin cave and picks up his sword, leading to his butler walking into the room. And then we get to arguably the most confusing exchange between two individuals that I've ever seen in a film up to this point. There might be other examples of worse interactions, but this is so gargantuan in its sheer bloody idiocracy that it's altering the very fabric of reality around me. Bernard tells Harry about the night his father died and just so casually mentions that he cleaned his father's wounds. Upon this rather casual citation of events, he remarks that the blade which killed Norman Osborn came from his glider, and failed to mention this rather important detail any other day night, birthday, Christmas, or goddamn Halloween since that evening for some unspeakably stupid reason. But the absolute best part of this scene is that it retroactively does even more harm to the first film, which is a fucking impressive feat considering the awful that was already on display. How do I mean this? Well, dear viewer, let me ask you a question. Or rather, let me ask you a series of questions, none of which have an answer from me, as I believe in the idea of figuring things out for yourself. Oh, but don't worry, the answers to these questions are remarkably easy, so have no fear. First question, who else do you think would have examined Norman's body after the butler? Oh, that was an easy one, right? Yes! Well, try these for a spin. What same conclusion would these people come to as the butler? Here's a hint. He told Harry that very same conclusion. Oh, but wouldn't that then mean these people would have also figured out Norman was Green Goblin? Maybe. However, would these people have had access to the evidence required to make this assessment? Ah, and now we've hit a bit of a snag because this one doesn't actually have a clear answer. Because in order for them to come to this conclusion, they would need access to the glider and armor Norman was equipped with, which would have swabs of his DNA as well as some of Peter's DNA, making the connection infinitely easier to come to. So then why didn't they arrive at said conclusion? Bit of a brain teaser, right? Well, think of this. Who was present with Norman when he died? Who was it that disrobed him of his gear and delivered his naked body to the house? Who was it that had the job? No, the responsibility of giving this equipment to the necessary people as evidence. Wait, no, surely he did, right? No! Surely people gave up this equipment to the authorities instead of getting rid of the evidence, right?
That's impossible.
Oh, but if he did, then they would have figured out who Norman was, right? Yes! And by doing this, they would have been able to give Harry at least some sort of closure that he desperately needed, right?
This is the part where you run away.
If it hasn't become clear to you yet, then boy oh boy are the next few minutes of this video going to suck for Spider-Man 1 fans. Peter could not have delivered the armor and glider as evidence to the police due to the fact that these movies would have drastically been altered had this been done. Norman would have been publicly outed as the Green Goblin and Harry would have had some grasp of what happened to his father. This does a few things for Peter's character, none of which are good. Peter had been given a request from Norman himself asking him not to tell Harry, likely meaning not to tell Harry he was Green Goblin. Now, any reasonable person would expect him to honor the request to a certain degree, preferring it if Harry found out through the aid of authorities, rather than Peter being the one to tell him, honoring the request. However, what Peter seems to have done is prevent any information of the attack being held as evidence by the proper authorities. If his reasoning for doing this was to honor the wishes of Norman, a psychopathic mass murderer, then that makes Peter a very bad person. He was willing to sacrifice his friendship with his one and only friend, someone who was with him all throughout high school, because of some misguided attempt at protecting him from the truth. Despite the fact that literally 5 seconds before delivering the body, Norman had already tried shish kebabbing him and turning him into a Sunday snack. Ignoring how he is massively impending a police investigation, as well as allowing the families of every victim harmed by Norman the misfortune of not knowing who killed their kin, Peter is also being incredibly, seriously harmful towards Harry's mental health by refusing to make him aware of what happened. Harry is clearly mentally worse off not knowing the truth and being kept in the dark of that evening. We see this in multiple scenes throughout the trilogy, and ultimately that choice leads Harry down to this sinister path. So considering that Peter made this decision for Harry in a vain attempt to protect him, then surely he would tell Harry what happened after recognizing that this decision was not the best, directly leading to Harry not being in the right state of mind. You also completely ignored him after the revelation at the end of the last film for weeks before MJ got married, so what was a few more months? Think of it like applying for 2 jobs at the same time. You get asked to go for one job by someone you trusted, but upon closer examination you find out the second job offers more money. Which do you take at that point? Keep in mind, this is the same person who ignored a kid getting mugged in broad daylight, as well as allowing crime rates to skyrocket simply because he was a human chub for a few weeks. So there is that. What a fantastic set of morals you have there, Peter. What a great guy you are. In fairness, this is a plot element which occurs at the tail end of the film, so I can't possibly expect it to engage in all of those details immediately. But do you really have to make the ending so incredibly shit? Not to mention there was an entire sequel to discuss this incredibly important plot point in more detail. But oh well, I guess the third film is the shit one for bringing attention to a problem that has existed for 2 years already in this universe. So now think of this. If we can agree that Peter has been a shitty person since even the first film, with multiple instances of him making conscious decisions to be a bad person to his friends, and even the citizens of the city, then can we, in good conscience, say that Peter was actually assassinated in the third film? Or is it just the logical next step his character was destined to make as a result of his many misguided deeds? I really believe that this desire to be recognized as a celebrity is in line with real-world examples, as well as being a justifiable desire to have, leading to realistic conflicts in his love life. And after he comes into contact with the symbiote suit, his actions are no longer really his own, as he's being partially mind-controlled by the suit, feeding off of his aggression and amplifying it. So for at least half the film, he isn't actually capable of being held accountable for his actions. So how do you call that an assassination? In fact, if anything, it's remarkably consistent with how he's been depicted throughout these films if you just think about how his actions as well as his inactions have affected people he's close to. Man, that must be ticking off a lot of people. Oh, and the butler is a massive cunt too for not being forthcoming with this information earlier to Harry or the police, don't get me wrong. But even he is likely to have signed a non-disclosure agreement of some kind, or even just not liking Harry and finding it kinda funny. So whatever, still doesn't excuse Peter for being such a shit cunt now, does it? And keep in mind, this film brings attention to this flaw from the first film, but doesn't then mean it created that flaw. It always existed, but was never something that required much thought, until now. So then that begs another question. Does that make this movie weaker as a sequel for refusing to acknowledge the flaws of its prequels, or would that be seen as unfair to the feature, since neither of these superior films took the time to fully explore these issues in their plots? I like to think it's the later, as you can't expect the third film in the series to be the one which has to answer for each and every single fuck up of its predecessors, especially considering how bloated this picture is already. That's just mental, mate. Honestly, it seems like it was a task which the second film needed to handle, but obviously decided against in order to have that rather lime milky colored fungus soup of a plot. Now, of course, you could argue that this element of the story should just have been ignored entirely, since there was no reason to mention it if the previous films felt it was necessary to ignore, and view what the butler does here as lampshading to an extent. But I view it more as a hand wave, which isn't necessarily good or bad writing, but rather a clumsy attempt to fill up a plot hole that already existed by using a retcon, since there was no mention of Bernard's involvement before this point. Quite frankly, the guy has been a ghost throughout these movies, so I can definitely understand why this particular moment is seen as so out of nowhere. Retcons are also not necessarily a form of bad writing either, because when done well, it can retroactively improve a story through additional information, which contradicts established lore or answers questions alluded to without adding excessive new questions. Prime example being the plot twist at the end of Empire Strikes Back with the revelation that Darth Vader is Luke's father, giving the audience one of the most iconic moments in the film while also changing the way we viewed Obi-Wan by this point, as he lied about Luke's father in the last film. It's ultimately a matter of execution, and as always, this film didn't have enough time to execute what could have been a good idea, so I'm not going to be too hard on it. Nevertheless, let us proceed. I would like to know how Venom is actually capable of creating these webs seemingly out of its own body. How exactly is this creature capable of expanding itself to such a degree from less than a meteorite size? How does it feed off of the aggression of its amplified hosts? How does that actually translate to nutrition? Does it bind itself to the host's DNA and gain nutrition as a byproduct whenever the host feeds? If so, would that increase Peter's calorie intake from the second film? Oh god, imagine if I had to do all that nonsense again. Thankfully I'm not. Right? Yeah, of course not. Let's move on. Hot take time, but the combination of Peter getting his suit from the suitcase as well as the triumphant swing into the heat of battle is a better hero prep scene than the one we got in Spider-Man 2, and no, this is not a joke. The slow rising score in each scene, along with the anticipation building up parallel to said score, creates a sense of interest and excitement that I don't feel as clearly in the Clockwork Tower scene. Also, side note, but if we get a combination of this score and the and the TASM score playing together as they join the MCU in No Way Home, then you know I'm jumping out of my chair. That shit gonna be hype as fuck. As the fight begins, we see Venom swinging in from off-screen as a surprise attack and manages to successfully land the first blow. He then proceeds to troll the living fuck out of Peter as he gives the second funniest performance in the film in just one line. Sorry shitposting Harry, but he got you beat. It's also pretty in character for Eddie to do this sort of thing as he has been depicted throughout the film as attention-seeking and clamoring for validation from his peers and superiors. His desire to gloat in front of Peter and make him aware just how much he embarrassed Eddie is petty, but when you're wearing a suit that literally amplifies your negative emotions, then petty starts becoming dangerous. I have no issue with his reasoning or motivation, but the delivery and performance is kinda cringe, which makes him seem more like a troll than a foil. After goading Peter by grabbing MJ, Peter then reacts to this threat by jumping towards Eddie, who then promptly smacks him in the mouth. Now Peter, acting like a retard, seems pretty standard by this point, so just bear with it till the film is ended. But why did you jump towards him instead of shooting him with a web?
God damn it!
Here's another thing. In the news report about the incident, there's a camera zoom of MJ's face which gets her from an upper angle. Now keep in mind, this camera has yet to move while MJ on the other hand has descended a few stories in her fall, meaning she is closer to the ground. And as we know, the cameras on the ground are pretty capable of getting a clear image of the car. So when Peter has his mask taken off, why exactly are there literally 0 cameras capable of spotting his face? Especially since he goes for a tumble off of the web, even landing on the ground. There should have been tons of people on the ground, all with cameras capable of seeing Peter's face at this point. His secret identity would no longer remain a secret as his face is shown all across national television. Which honestly could have been a pretty cool thing to do as the entire world watches their hero meet his fate, only for them to come to the conclusion Peter was just an ordinary guy. Think of how effective that would have been for a final confrontation in this franchise. You could have had reaction shots of a variety of different people, such as JJ on the ground witnessing this from a first-hand perspective, mirroring his self-reflection scene in the second film, but now with an added shock of knowing who Peter really is. Aunt May crying in her home as she holds a picture of Uncle Ben, Mr. Dickovich embracing his daughter, Flash Thompson, who does make a return in this film during the funeral, perhaps realizing that he bullied a superhero, or even Betty, who admits that she liked Peter but never bothered to mention it. Other properties which have done this concept well were Batman Arkham Knight and even Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse with the news of Peter Parker's death. It makes for compelling cinema when we see our hero at their weakest moment, while also getting a reaction from people in this world which shows us how they view him or her, as well as how opinions change once the truth is known. But then again, this film was made with the idea of creating a third sequel still in the works, so perhaps they didn't want to deal with the consequences of such a decision. We know how challenging that concept can be. Whatever, let's keep going. Why exactly was this truck webbed up here? What purpose did this serve? I get putting MJ and her car up here, but also including this entirely random construction truck? Was it because you wanted a method of MJ becoming involved in saving Peter? Was it because you wanted to create more character drama with the situation? What was it, Raimi? Why did Venom feel like it was necessary to web this stupid truck up here and not include more vehicles? This isn't even lucky, it's just fucking stupid. There's no discernible reason for why he felt the need to do this. So it not only makes the fact that MJ saved Peter's life incredibly contrived, but it also creates a dangerous situation for our character which actively affects the plot. For no reason. So why not just have her take a broken headrest from her car and drop that? Why not have her jump from the car before it gets ready to go down for another tumble? After Peter grabs his mask, he is reintroduced to Sandman, who has taken upon himself to cosplay as a Titan from AOT, increasing his size to several stories high. Now, was there never a point during this entire confrontation that anyone present at this location thought to themselves, hang on a second, wouldn't water work? Considering that even the news anchor referred to Marco as the Sandman, it didn't need to play a factor in the final fight, as we could have seen Sandman destroying any attempts to attack him with water, but it would have been a cool detail nonetheless. Now, my thoughts on this brutal display are actually pretty positive. While Spider-Man's durability in the first 2 films has been rather inconsistent, this picture has actually been pretty dependable and reliably depicting consistent durability from Peter, as he is never really hit too often in the film, which means the moment where he is taking damage doesn't have any issues connected to it, as there's no baseline for saying he can't endure these attacks. You could also cite the scene of him stopping a train with his body for what the maximum level of pain he can endure actually is, making this scene even more plausible. Added on top of this is the fact that both villains behave competently and act quickly once Spider-Man starts demonstrating resistance. distance. Venom is as agile as Peter is and manages to tag him out of escaping Sandman, pinning him down as Marco flattens him like a pancake. What this demonstrates to me is effectiveness as an individual as well as cooperation with a teammate, quickly setting this duo up as an acceptable threat to our hero. Add the fact that they have been demonstrated dealing with the authorities in a quick and brutal manner, and you have a standard to work off on, explaining how likely they are to win here, as no one else can stop them. In less than 10 minutes, Raimi has created more believable stakes with these two opponents than just over 4 hours of content before now. Each member is using their powers to the best of their ability, and neither of them act arrogantly without having a believable advantage. Fucking great stuff, boys. Then, as all hope appears to be lost, you have Harry arriving just in the nick of time, managing to blow up Sandman's head with a Goblin grenade. Not to mention that his arrival is met with a rendition of the Goblin theme from the first film, which is a pretty neat callback to the character's roots.
English, motherfucker, do you speak it?
However, rather than seeming sinister, the theme evokes its own heroic styles that starts blending into the main battle theme of the film, just as Harry himself joins forces with Peter to take on Venom and Sandman. It's actually really well done, to be honest. However, in saying that, I would have preferred it if Venom opened the fight with his webs instead of pouncing at Peter. It's not like Peter did the same thing to you a few moments ago which you countered with ease. Perhaps he is relying on a physical dominance over Peter, since Venom does seem to be depicted as physically stronger at least, judging by how he ragdolls Peter at times. He is also far more animalistic, likely as a result of giving himself over to the symbiote completely, unlike Peter was. So is it safe to call this a character flaw instead of a writing one? Maybe. Doesn't really seem to have much of an effect since Harry readied himself with his arm blades, so he could likely have freed Peter with a simple slash of his arm, changing nothing. God, I love extras. Look at these two. Fucking goofballs overreacting at everything. We also get a pretty decent moment of levity from this interaction between JJ and his new boss. It helps ease the tension of the scene, especially now that Harry has arrived, so I have no issue with its placement, unlike the French receptionist. Oh man, we get more demonstrations of competent teamwork between Harry and Peter as Peter saves Harry from an attack, with Harry's board being capable of recovering and locating him mid-flight, making a comeback in this scene. We get call-outs and immediate response to the danger MJ faces, instead of just staring at it and doing nothing for a few minutes. Sandman also remains an ever-present threat as they scale the building, almost tagging them twice before MJ falls, so that's neat. I also like how Peter's powers complement Harry's tech, with the film showing us he can change direction and speed with his webs. Why is this film considered the worst again?
I don't know.
Harry and Peter then manage to catch MJ, which leads to Peter dropping her off inside the building, just above ground level. Now, Peter taking a second to talk to MJ can be seen as an issue, but considering that all he does is make sure she is alright while taking a second to breathe, I don't find it that big of a deal. Especially since Harry rushes him anyways, which leads to a consequence being made as a result of the tally, taking Peter out of the fight. And since he is likely still dazed from his several squishies, I can buy him being too knackered to move, similar to how it was handled in the second film. This then leads to Harry firing his missiles into Sandman, effectively taking him out of the fight till the end of the scene. This caused me to ask myself a few questions, which I managed to give answers to after thinking about them for a bit. First question. Why didn't Harry open his entrance with the missiles? They seem to be the most effective weapons against the Sandman and would likely have ended the fight immediately. Well, it does seem to me like Harry only used these missiles once he had a clear line of sight and knew the falling debris and excess explosion wouldn't harm anybody else in the area as a result. For example, accidentally burying Peter in several kgs of sand. He can see that Peter is out of the way and that Sandman isn't near the civilians at this point, so his rocket seemed like a decent choice to make. Second question, why didn't Sandman recreate his giant form and continue the fight? Well, this one doesn't exactly have a clear answer, but we can assume some stuff. This is the largest body which Sandman has managed to create up to this point, without practice mind you. So that is something to consider. And since this is a form of such giant stature and size, one would expect that this would come with a lot of strain on either his mind or his body, requiring him to rest in between sessions as he regains his thoughts and stamina. There are no lines to confirm this in the film, and this is not something which is ever brought up again, which unfortunately means this is an appeal to inference, which again I'm not a big fan of. Instead, what I'd like from this film is if we got explanations to some degree of why Sandman hasn't continued partaking in this battle using that form or even any form for that matter. Until such an explanation can be given, I will be considering this an issue with the fight, even if I can reason it for myself. But besides that, the first half of this battle has been pretty good, for the most part. As we arrive at the Venom segment of this battle, we begin the stage with Peter being incapable of sensing danger above him using his Peter Tingle. Now, I have a history with calling out this ability in previous films, as it was never depicted to be consistent with how it was used. Either possessing the ability to radar in on flying opponents who don't pose a direct threat to Peter from miles away in the sky before they've even done anything, to giving him a personal sense of slow motion, or just flat out refusing to work until a split second before something makes contact with his body. This is also ignoring all the times it just doesn't even exist. So then, does that mean I have an issue with how it's used in this context? Well, not really. And there are reasons for that, some of which you might not like. I'm going to be making an appeal to adaptation real quickly because there is something I'd like to mention. Please forgive me. But in other iterations of the character, Venom possessed the ability to bypass Peter's spider sense completely, which added to his threat level. And the reason for this is because the symbiote had learned everything about Peter's power set at that point, as well as how to combat them, leading to it allowing Venom the ability to basically enter stealth mode without being caught by Peter's early warning system. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because this seems to have been implemented into this film based on how Peter is incapable of finding Venom. We already know that the suit is capable of giving Eddie memories as well as an exact copy of Peter's powers. Hell, Eddie even trolls Peter by saying his spidey senses are tingling, which as far as I'm aware isn't even public knowledge, so how the hell would he know to make fun of this? Well, same way he's done anything by this point, because the symbiote allows him to. This is admittedly outside knowledge which I've possessed for a long time even before viewing this film for the first time as a child, but considering the basis for this counter ability's existence being applicable to this version of Venom, based on what we know and see, I'm fine with saying he can do this. If you aren't, then that's alright, just don't call me a hypocrite. His CGI didn't age too well though. Quite frankly, neither did Peter's. The over-reliance of CGI faces in this final fight is kinda hideous. We have also arrived at my biggest problem with this fight, and it's a bit of a downer considering how good the scene has been so far. Why did Harry decide to stop throwing shit at Venom and instead attempt to close the distance with his hoverboard blades? We know based on his fight with Peter at the beginning of the film, he has access to multiple bladed bats which can be thrown at once, where here he only threw 2. Not to mention that in the second battle with Peter at the Osborn mansion, there appears to be a few dozen pumpkin bombs lined up on the wall, with at least 2 bladed bombs on the table being programmed in some capacity. That is, unless all the pumpkins on the wall are standard explosives, meaning the blades on the table are the only bladed long-range weaponry he has, which in hindsight would be a cool visual detail if this were true. I just don't get why this is true, because why would he only make a handful of these bats? Is the argument that he didn't have much time to work on them and only made as many as he thought he'd need, with the bombs on the wall being spares from his dad's days? This does seem to be the case considering the wall mounts from the previous film, so maybe. But even then, surely some of Norman's bombs were bladed too, right? You could argue Harry was in a rush and only took as much as he had the time to afford taking, but even then, acquiring some bombs off the wall seems more preferable to taking the blades on the table and repackaging them, right? Or did he only rely on whatever ammo the board still had? That seems more likely, to be honest, as it falls in line with the logic of him being in a hurry. I don't know, man. I could spend a decent time trying to think of what he did and did not do, when in reality it should have been explained in the film. He has access to far too much ammunition to be running out this early, so perhaps including a line saying he was in a rush to get here, or even that his board is damaged and he can't access more bombs? Just something, honestly. After Harry has his board hijacked and Peter figures out how to stop the symbiote, Venom takes the board and attempts to use the blades to impale Peter. Out of impulse, Harry decides to jump in between them, catching the blow intended for Peter, and effectively sacrificing his life for his best friend. Now, I have heard criticisms that Harry should have tried using his remote control feature for the board to stop Venom from impaling Peter, but I feel the need to question this. Considering the angle of the thrust, wouldn't the board have flown straight into Peter before managing to course correct itself? Especially since the navigation controls seem to be manual? How much time would this have taken, and could Harry have feasibly made the correct request in time without mucking up the input by mistake? Looks as if he wouldn't have had enough time to consider this option, let alone do it, so his reactionary impulse to save his friend seems pretty reasonable to me, honestly. It was a split-second call, and if he failed to make the right one, Peter would have died. You also have to consider the fact he did manage to hit his head again after being hijacked, which would very likely have impacted his thinking skills, so no issue from me, Chief. We have a pretty bad editing issue in between frames of Harry being thrown and Venom dropping the board. In this shot he's remarkably close to Peter, but in the second he's significantly further away, to the point he has to make a horizontal leap in order to get back to Peter, instead of just whipping him up again and stabbing him with the board.
Okay.
You remember when I said that Harry not bringing enough throwables was my biggest issue?
I lied.
It's this without even a shadow of a doubt. It's really bad. Venom teleports between frames and decides to reduce his optimal range by dropping the board as well as allowing Peter to escape and not webbing his hand up again. Keep in mind that in the previous film, Peter regularly demonstrated the ability to snipe objects from far away distances. And as Venom is a copy, why would he lack this ability? Whatever, let's just get to the end. So why was Eddy allowed to keep his clothes on but Peter wasn't? Even in frames where Eddy shows his face, you can clearly tell he's not wearing a shirt underneath. Well, I guess it's because this film wouldn't have a PG rating if he was naked, so I think it's fine. It literally has zero effect on the plot, so whatever. I have also heard the criticism that Peter doesn't try saving Eddy with his web after throwing the grenade, but considering that Eddy was already jumping in between Peter's recovery frames, I don't think it's feasible to expect Peter being capable of reacting that quickly, especially since he seemed hyper-focused on the symbiote. It's not like he could have gotten him out in time either, so really not an issue. Moving on. Where the fuck have you been? As Peter processes what just happened with Venom, he gets met up by Flint, who explains that he never wanted the situation to happen, and that he did it out of necessity for his dying daughter, as he needed the money. He explains what happened the night his uncle died, and asks Peter not for forgiveness, but for him to understand why he did what he did. He exclaims that he never chose to be this, most likely referring to him being a monster, and says the only thing left to him now is his daughter. Peter says he forgives him and allows Marco to escape, and this has caused a lot of people to have great grievances with the scene, as they believe Marco was redeemed far too quickly. It is also a common line of thinking that Marco is unbelievable as a sympathetic good person, simply doing bad things because he hurt people throughout the film's runtime, as well as killing at least one person. And as always, the contrarian in me has an issue with this. I think I'll tackle the idea of him being redeemed/forgiven too quickly. Throughout this film, Peter has been struggling with the idea of forgiveness overcoming his desire for revenge, as well as forgiving himself for being a terrible person at times. In Aunt May's scene after Peter defeated Sandman, she brings up the fact that Uncle Ben would have viewed revenge as a poison which would turn good people ugly and into something they were not. That he didn't want Peter living even 1 second with the concept in his heart. This confused Peter throughout the conversation, who thought the news of Marco's death would please Aunt May, that it was justified because he murdered Uncle Ben. What this led to was a case of personal introspection from the character where he considered if he was doing the right thing anymore. And while this specific conversation didn't get brought up again, Peter did have to deal with the guilt of knowing he unintentionally hurt someone and had to come to terms with it. Luckily, Aunt May was there again to give him the advice he needed. She encouraged him to do the hardest thing and forgive himself, knowing that he was a good person and would find a way to make things right. What this does for Peter as a character in this moment is it makes him understand the position that Marco is in, even seeing elements of himself in Marco as they have a mutual understanding of living with the mistakes they've made and wanting to make amends. Peter can tell that Marco is being a genuine person at this moment and understands that he seeks redemption for his actions because he knows what it's like to experience the same guilt. And so he does through Marco what he wishes he could do to himself. He forgives him. I do not think this scene was meant to show Marco's redemption, but rather Peter's, as he managed to do the one thing he's been struggling to do this entire trilogy. Unlike Doc Ock's redemption when he shut down a reactor, or even Harry's redemption of helping Peter fight off this deadly alliance, Sandman is yet to have a moment where he can rectify his actions in a meaningful way, and was likely something that was planned for the sequel. However, since that plan went up in smoke just like Marco did, this was Marco's canonical last appearance until No Way Home. So it meant that a lot of people upon a rewatch saw this as his only redeeming moment in the series, not considering that it failed to match any similar redeeming moment from other villains. But hey, that's just a theory.
Objection!
Now I think I'll tackle the idea of him not being a sympathetic villain. According to SK Comics, who made a pretty neat video on Spider-Man Homecoming, link in the description if you'd like to check that out, Sandman is a bad character because he views him as inconsistent in his beliefs. He finds it odd that Marco is willing to harm another person and potentially put them in a position which can lead to their deaths, but still be upset about killing Uncle Ben even years after the incident. He wonders why Sandman doesn't just fly to another city and rob banks there, since he wanted to avoid fighting and killing Spider-Man, as well as advocating for him giving verbal warnings before harming people. We also came to a mutual conclusion that Sandman would only rob banks at night with this belief, but I'll get to that in a second. Not to mention he found his redemption arc to be bullshit, as well as being confused at Marco no longer wanting to kill Spider-Man, which is a fair thing to bring up. I think I've done a decent enough job explaining why the redemption angle is not exactly right, as well as why it works, so I don't feel the need to repeat myself there, but as for everything else I think I should start at the beginning. Marco has inconsistent beliefs and he exclaims he does not have the desire to harm people, but does it anyway. Now I find this particular point to be odd because people tend to do things they don't like all the time. Prime example of this is people who get get up every morning to go to work? Is their desire to stay home, preferring not to work, an inconsistent belief if they go to work anyways? Marco finds himself in a very difficult position because it is made clear to us from his initial scene that the reason why he's a criminal in the first place is because he needs the money to help his dying daughter. This motivation is a strong one and makes it believable to the audience that even a good man would be willing to risk it all if it meant helping his sick child. Children are typically viewed as innocent by most people and cultures around the world, with children usually being depicted in media as needing to be protected. From films such as Jurassic Park with Dr. Grant saving Richard Hammond's grandkids from flesh-eating dinosaurs, to Joel from The Last of Us risking the fate of humanity in order to keep Ellie safe from a procedure she did not consent to. Grant is understood to be a good person as he never harms another being in the film, nor does he even attack a dinosaur, usually being depicted as an innocent victim in a rather unfortunate circumstance. Joel, on the other hand, is very much not a good person.
Fuck you, man. He told you what you wanted. I ain't telling you shit.
That's all right. I believe him.
No, wait!
He is regularly shown doing immoral things for the sake of looking after himself and Ellie, and is responsible for the deaths of quite a few people. And yet he is still one of the most beloved characters in fiction due to his relationship with Ellie. His decision to save her at the end of the film is heavily debated because of how many people who like him defend him for his actions. Now, why is that? How can we have such diametrically opposed characters, and yet if I were to ask the average person who they liked more between the two, most people would tend to pick Joel? Is it because they have a bias towards the media he comes from? Maybe, but Jurassic Park is still quite popular, so that can't be the only reason. Is it because they recently played The Last of Us and haven't seen Jurassic Park in a while? Possibly, they are a few years apart in terms of release date. If I had to take a gander, it would be that more people related to Joel and his struggles than they did for Dr. Grant. More people are capable of seeing themselves in Joel's shoes, or perhaps even related to his relationship with Ellie, seeing a bit of their own familiar connections in these two fictional characters. They can empathize and relate to their struggles while not necessarily going through a zombie outbreak themselves. Another more applicable answer is because he does horrendous things in order to help Ellie while admitting he doesn't particularly like them. That it's done out of necessity in order to survive, which humanizes him significantly. If Joel had the option not to kill someone if he didn't have to, then he usually took it while being cautious about the decision. And it's the same thing here. Marco is depicted as not being a good person, usually harming others as he attempts to rob them, and yet he admits to not liking this aspect of his life, that he didn't want to harm people and only did it because he thought it could help his daughter. I find it perfectly acceptable that he could regret his decisions and live with the guilt of his actions long after doing them, since this is a path he didn't even choose. And if he did, then it was done out of desperation. It was done for survival. Marco clearly laments his actions at the end of the film, but he also does it a few times during the film, most notably when Peter calls him out for killing Uncle Ben. You can see it in his expression as he remembers what happened that night. When accused of murdering a man by his wife, he reacts angrily and says,
It wasn't like that. It wasn't. I had good reason for what I was doing. And that's the truth.
The first piece of important information that Captain Stacy gives Aunt May and Peter was that Marco admitted his crime to his cellmate before escaping, which clearly indicates guilty conscience. There's definitely an attempt to create a thorough through line of Marco's character throughout this film, but due to the issue of so many other plot lines running at the same time and being introduced at blazing speed, the audience member can be forgiven for not picking up on these details, or just flat out forgetting them as they try processing all this new information. It also doesn't help that Flint isn't given as much time to develop as a character compared to Peter, Harry, MJ, or even fucking Eddie. His one defining trait is his motivation for helping his daughter, but besides that, he is usually just depicted as the monster of the week. If you didn't believe me before when I said this movie should have saved Sandman for the fourth film, well, I fucking hope you do now. So to answer the question, yes, Marco does have consistent beliefs which he has to forego in order to help the one person who is worth breaking his morals for. But that's not the end of this convo, just yet. I still need to address 4 more points. Oh boy. Question number 2. Why didn't Marco fly to another city and rob banks there if he wanted to avoid fighting and killing Spider-Man, as well as why didn't he give verbal warnings? Thankfully, this question isn't going to take nearly as long to answer. First part is Marco is in a bit of a hurry and is under a lot of stress to help his daughter before she dies of sickness, creating a case of urgency that is going to heavily affect how he operates. The second part is that Marco has only been shown capable of interacting with objects while being in somewhat of a tangible form, which makes sense because a sand cloud can't grab things, allegedly. If Sandman needs to physically walk with the money he takes every time he robs a bank, then that would mean he is going to be taking significantly longer to get the money where it needs to go if he needs to move to another city. This would cause an interruption to his case of urgency in helping his daughter, which is a no-go option. At this point, getting rid of Spider-Man would give him the ability to rob as many banks in the city as possible without facing nearly as much resistance, which is why the offer was so tempting to him. It meant he didn't need to be a monster for much longer, which, judging by his dialogue with Peter in the finale, seemed like a secondary goal he kept very much to himself. Still, pretty understandable, as this depiction of Sandman is supposed to be reminiscent of classical horror story monsters such as Frank in Stein's Monster. The second part of this question is, why doesn't he give verbal warnings? And yeah, I get this. You have a guy who doesn't want to cause harm but will do it without giving fair warning. It's a bit confusing. Problem with this is we do know Sandman is willing to give warnings or even ask to be left alone, as he does it with Spider-Man in 2 different scenarios. During the truck robbery after Spider-Man arrives, Flint warns him and says, "I don't want to hurt you, leave now," which resulted in Spider-Man not taking him seriously, leading to a fight. For the second time this happens, Flint basically hits a wall after being spooked by Spider-Man, then asks him, "What do you want from me?" Clearly wanting to be left alone as he asks Spider-Man why he's antagonizing him. This one isn't nearly as clear as the first one, but based on his body language, which shows a hunched up man acting defensively, I gathered that he was intending to be left alone, which is why he asks Spider-Man what he wants with him instead of telling him to piss off. You also have to consider that from Marco's perspective, he beat Spider-Man pretty badly and would assume that due to such an event, Spider-Man wouldn't be as openly antagonistic towards him. If Sandman was such a bad person, then he wouldn't even want to give a warning or ask what's the deal, he'd simply just attack. Now, you could reference his actions during the first robbery for a point against him giving a fair warning, but I'd like to examine that scene first. This is more than likely the same day Marco was reborn as Sandman, and is most assuredly the first time he is experiencing his powers in such a manner, which is likely going to mean he is less experienced in how to use it. Not to mention that every time there is a police officer on screen, they shoot him without warning, and understandably so. It's not every day you see such a beast. But that's not how Marco perceives himself, at least not yet, as he would likely still consider himself to be a person. And what do people tend to do when they are violently threatened like this? They react almost equally as violent in response, or they run away. It's simply a defense mechanism thanks to years of evolution. Marco manages to punch through the armored car, yet is still somehow soft enough to not kill the man inside, which we can take to mean different things. Either the film didn't want to depict the graphic murder of a police officer, or Sandman tried his best not to permanently harm the person underneath with his punch, preferring to cover them in sand. But then why allow for them to get into a crash? Good question, but do keep in mind who is also present in this truck and what their immediate goal is. The presence of Spider-Man was unexpected and definitely caused a hiccup in Marco's plan to steal the money. Based on his second robbery, which he completes at night with minimal casualties, I do think Marco's intention here was to cause as little damage as possible, but had to react violently when presented with a threat to his mission. We also don't get other examples of him giving other people fair verbal warning, and that's likely due to the fact we barely follow him as a character past this point. But I do believe it is fair to assume he tried with the guards in the second robbery if they didn't shoot at him first, based on his interaction with Spider-Man. It is also not an accident that he decided to rob a bank in the middle of the night for his second attempt, which led to as few possible casualties as he could manage, with the film only showing us one knocked out guard. I do feel that if Marco was given more focus in the film or was simply the only dedicated villain to follow, we would definitely have been seeing him making more and more attempts to remain as peaceful and as quiet as he could, the more he got a grasp on his powers. So that knocks out the third point. Last but not least, he decided to stop killing Spider-Man for some reason. Now, during my analysis of that scene, I did say I thought the reason why he took so long to reform was because he was overcoming the mental strain of holding that much larger body together for so long. And if we are to argue that he felt an element of pain thanks to the multiple explosions he tanked, then that would definitely help my case. But that still doesn't explain why he had such a change of heart at the end. And unfortunately, that's because the reason was taken out of the film. Apparently there was meant to be a scene which showed Marco's wife and daughter arriving on scene and managing to convince Flint not to kill Spider-Man, which would also have been the reason for why he said he only had his daughter left, likely implying he was going to live with her for as long as he could, until she passed. So in a sense, there is a defense for this, but not in any way that helps the film, as it requires content that isn't there, so we can call that one a draw. If there are any more criticisms that you guys have, please let me know in the comments and I'll try and address them if I can. But with that said, I'm going to stand by this point. I firmly believe that Sandman is the best written villain out of the selection we have in the Raimi films, the next contender being Venom. They both have their problems here and there, but ultimately the biggest issue they have going for them is time. They do not have enough time to properly develop as characters and needed to be given more screen space, likely in the form of 2 different films. They also have a lot going for them from character standpoints, especially Sandman, who I think was done a massive disservice. Eddy could have been explored as the polar opposite of Peter much more, and could have had a long-lasting impact on the franchise had he been done properly instead of just being tacked on for the sake of recognizable iconography. And yet with that said, if in some magical version of reality where Spider-Man 3 was the only Raimi film to exist, I would have to say that Harry was the best villain and second best character of the film. He has the most development of almost any character, he goes through several arcs in the story, some done better than others, and he has easily the best fight scene in the series, let alone the film, with only an average second encounter and playing an important role in the Team Rumble section of the movie. Unfortunately, he is tied to 2 other films where he is about as helpful as a dementia patient doing your taxes. The amount of tentacle blades in this film have been drastically reduced in quantity, as almost every single fight of this film has the opponents using their abilities in a competent manner, or have believable character reasons for not being used to the full effect. And I still haven't finished the film yet, but thankfully there isn't much to talk about, so let's wrap this up. As Peter descends down to comfort Harry, I have to go ahead and ruin the moment, but can't Peter just carry him down towards the ambulances, which very likely have been called to help in case of injury to any civilian near the fighting, as well as the police officers who got injured during the counterattack from Venom and Sandman? No. Okay, fine, Harry's dying, it's fine, it's okay, let's go. It's actually a pretty touching moment considering how much more of a relationship they've had in this film, so kudos to you, movie. You made him a person again. Although I just find this ending message from Peter to be ringing kinda hollow, honestly. While I liked Harry's death scene, this speech is not at all appropriate to what happened, my dude. It would have been more poignant if you honestly didn't have any narration and just said goodbye to your friend. But yeah, suppose we gotta hit those references and nostalgia buttons with the audience, hey. Speaking of nostalgia buttons, the final shot doesn't do that, as we get an actual honest-to-God touching moment between our 2 leads, as they just slow dance the pain away, clearly trying to amend their relationship. It's not the conversation I wanted, but after all the nonsense this film threw at me so quickly, it's kinda relieving just to have a moment of peace like this. And that's it. That's the movie. Goodness gracious, was that a long one. Phew! Glad that's over, and now I get to just give some final thoughts. This film is a mess. There's so much going on that at some points it becomes confusing to follow. But damn is there still a lot of stuff worthy of praise in this movie. From the cinematography to the use of music, character design and CGI, for the most part. Costumes, fight choreography, motivation and desire, character arcs, even the ironic use of emo Parker, it easily makes this film the most entertaining of the trilogy. Unfortunately, this movie is definitely half-baked in basically every aspect of its story. It suffers from lack of time. You have the last-minute addition of a 4th antagonist in the final 15 minutes of the movie, who is about as threatening as a bag of party poppers whenever he speaks, but typically gets treated as just another monster. Speaking of monsters, holy shit did this film abuse Sandman as a character. Such an interesting use of a tragic villain, and the best thing this film managed to do with him was create a redemption arc for Peter. You could have explored so much about him, such as examining how he now views his body after the transformation. How is he coping with having to harm more people because he has to help his daughter? Is he ever scared, or does he ever doubt his own cause? It makes me wonder if Raimi actually knew what he had to work with here, because this is easily enough material to make a full feature. Just such a disappointment. Harry's redemption is also reliant on very important fact being hidden away from him by his butler, so that's nice. Peter acts like a rusty spoon after fighting Harry but not trying to contact MJ as mentioned before. Some of the other bigger issues in this film are the 2 big contrivances with the symbiote meteorite and Eddy visiting the church, which are so unlikely in their plausibility that it makes even someone like me scratch their head and go, hang on a second, that's shit. There are also some funky uses of CGI, especially in the final fight, but for the most part this film is absolutely stunning, with the best visual moment definitely going to the Sandman forming scene. The acting has been on point throughout, with Peter's Bully Maguire performance being the only one I could point to as kinda bad, though he makes up for it in meme potential. But besides that, I can't really think of anything that harms the overall plot of this film that I haven't already mentioned, especially in comparison to other Spider-Man movies. The biggest issue facing this film was the pacing and structure of its many stories, but the stories themselves weren't terrible. They definitely have merit, and if they were to be properly explored and expanded, they would have made for quite frankly amazing films in their own right. I understand that Raimi was under pressure to include Venom, but considering he already had plans to include Vulture, I can't exactly blame Avi for making this film so bloated since he wasn't the one who wrote the film. Credit where credit is due, and consequences for everyone in the poo, it's only fair. Raimi and his team should have done a better job implementing these characters, as well as just flat out leaving some of the stuff for a fourth installment. I am a heavy advocate for making Sandman his own main villain in another film, and have explained my reasons why. At this moment, I'm certain my thoughts on this film have been made pretty clear, and at risk of repeating myself for the whateverth time, I think I should wrap this up. This film isn't good, it isn't bad, it's just above average. For the reasons I have provided throughout this film, I'm going to be giving it a 6 out of 10. I was going to be giving it a 5, but since this film benefits a lot from Bully Maguire's antics, I think it deserves the extra point. Despite the problems this movie possesses, it also does a surprising amount of legwork to fix some of the problems found in earlier films, which I reckon should be commended on. Its biggest flaw is simply lack of explanation, which can only really bring a film down so much, and as always it goes into some spot on my tier list. Let's see here real quick. Of course, the C category. Fucking big yikes, man. The supposed worst Raimi film turning out to be the best is a bit of a lol to me, but feel free to be wrong in the comments if you'd like. Before I depart, I want to give a sort of final summary on my thoughts of the trilogy, as well as what I think Sam Raimi's intentions were for the films. I feel that these movies were meant to reflect an interpretation of the classic comics despite its inaccuracies. Tapping into the campy fun elements of those stories while also trying to carve its own identity in the form of its character drama. These films don't exactly play out like many other movies of its same genre. They feel lighter, if that makes sense, almost dreamlike in a way. They come off as very fantastical in the sense that they are aware of how unreal these events are. The first film especially taps into the childish wonder of what it would be like to become a superhero, instead of focusing on the grim reality of what these abilities would entail. It's why characters get punched 30 feet across hallways, the bad guy makes long monologues in the same vein as Saturday morning cartoon villains. The protagonist scores the girl despite not really trying, and the main character seems to be the most important person in the world. All of these smaller elements aid in the idea of playing up a power fantasy, and that's what these films really are. Fantasies. They are 2-hour-long daydream dosages which try and tell an interesting and entertaining story, while also trying to give some sort of heartfelt message to the audience. And that seems to be Sam's intentions. Not to create a well-written story, but a memorable fantasy. Something kids could grow up with and whose ideals they could implement in their lives. I'm not trying to say you can't criticize these films for doing this, but I think I've done that enough. I think I can just stop doing that for a few seconds. I really enjoy these movies. Maybe not as much as I used to, and perhaps I'm more critical of them now, but I can definitely understand what makes them so appealing, and to an extent, get why people are so annoyed at someone like me for pointing out these problems. I have faith that the general audience is capable of recognizing how silly these movies are, but to the general audiences, that's what makes them so fun. That's what gives them their charm. My intention with these films is to discover how well written they are when I apply my same standards used to judge other media. It's also to help disillusion people who think these films are well written. Because unfortunately not everyone is okay with settling for a memorable fantasy. If you are the kind of person who values the writing and the media they consume, then you need to be consistent in how you view media. Not cherry pick what is and isn't capable of analysis, just because you like it or because it's nostalgic. I'm not trying to sound mean when I say this either, but I really value consistency from people. Either it's all game or none of it is, and if none of it is game to you, then that's perfectly okay. Like what you want, dislike what you don't, and just carry on with your day. I hope you all had a magnificent time watching this video and that it was at least a little bit informative. I joked about this in the intro, but I do mean it. If you'd like to see more of my content, then please do like and subscribe, as that really helps me out. If you'd like to see more of me in between videos, then I co-host a podcast with some friends on UvuCast, where we discuss movies, TV shows, and plots to regain a connection to an interdimensional space god responsible for turning Jews into space aliens from the future.
They just had a giant 3D printer.
Yeah, they just had a 3D printer from space. It was a UFO one. But like humanity has created almost a perfect sphere out of silicon atoms to measure. It's actually a pretty cool story. They created a sphere so that they could relate back to the kilogram, because the kilogram was a physical object. So they wanted to tie it to silicon atoms, which don't change. Because the kilogram itself kept changing, and they're like, fuck, this is ruining everything.
Right, that's not very helpful for measurement.
We can't remove rocks with modern technology, sorry boys.
How long is this podcast gonna be? Yes.
Yeah.
I'm pretty certain some fucking tradies in a Ute can build a pyramid in like a week if you give them enough money.
If you give them enough blue V and pie.
I mean, they're not doing anything else right now with all the strikes, so sure. Why not build a fucking pyramid?
Yeah, I mean, I'd do it. I haven't been one to bury in it yet, but...
Yeah, I don't think it's changed. I think the price of games have gotten cheaper, but because people don't really...
Of course.
Oh yeah, it depends on... I think it'd probably be best for everyone if we just keep it to like the United States, just to like keep it generalized.
Yeah, so most of the retro...
most of us don't live in.
Most of the...
Yeah, but like, I mean, most games that he's probably going to mention were made in the States.
Yeah, I assume he's an American.
Most of the retro knowledge I have on games in
Why
general
do you assume
is...
he's an American? He has a British accent.
Wait,
because the games he's were most
you
likely
guys
made
hear
in
me
the
at
States.
all, or am I dead?
I can
No, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, so you've just been speaking over me, alright, sweet.
Yep.
No, it's
I've been
fine.
ignoring you.
Never mind, keep going.
You had nothing of work to say.
Ignoring the host of the
You weren't
stream.
there.
I was just gonna say, the
Look, you're
only...
just the host for the parasites. Do you think the parasites care about the host? Hell
Of course not. Symbiosis? Bullshit. It's all
Yeah.
about parasititis. Them.
So long, the kids start acting weird. They lock her in a closet for hours on end. What could this be an allegory for, I wonder? This...
No!
Holy shit.
Want her to get killed by the fucking lady of the lake, you actual fucking potato peel.
Yeah,
When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
It also doesn't help that I was kind of half paying attention whenever we were watching this movie, so I've kind of taken Darth's place in this matter when he only showed up for like
Yeah, true.
episode 6 of Blight through 9. So, I've never really liked these movies. The only time I liked them was when I was watching Phantom Menace on VHS. But even then, it's because I had a really scuffed copy where all 4 movies at the time, so that's Phantom Menace, Empire, New Hope, and Return of the Jedi, all kind of like crammed into one VHS. So if I wanted to watch the movie that I wanted to watch, I had to start from Phantom Menace and work all the way through. It was really weird.
Oh my god, what the fuck?
But yeah, the best thing I can say is I like the music. I think Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith have some of the best tracks I've heard in any movie.
Yeah, the music's really good. Elevates the material significantly.
I like Obi-Wan, especially in the 3rd movie. I think he's a pretty nifty character. I think Anakin is a wet sock given existence. Padme, I can't stand Padme. I think she's easily one of the worst aspects of these movies. I don't think Natalie Portman got given a lot to work with, so I don't really put a lot of blame on her because I think she is a good actress. I think George just sucks at direction in these particular brands of Space Wizard Kino. And that's really all I can say. Hand grenades given away.
So what you're saying is they're basically really good movies, and you love watching them.
No, I didn't say any of that. Were you paying attention, you fucking dumb shit?
All right, so
hey, at least it's better than the sequels.
We live stream every Saturday at 12 PM NZT and have covered videos discussing Bly Manor, Doom Eternal, the prequels, and much more. I also appear as a guest in a few other podcasts, links are all in the description. I'm still planning on covering the rest of the Spider-Man movies, including the MCU, as well as understand that they are already being covered by a few other people. But I believe in the idea that alternative perspectives give new ideas and outlooks, so stay tuned for that, I guess. Besides that, I'd like to wish you all a happy Halloween, Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, and even Christmas depending on when this comes out. Not to mention a happy new year when that rolls around, and that it's hopefully a better time this time around. Take care all, and goodbye.